picture a sleepy English village, St. Mary Mead, where a glamorous film star, Marina Gregg, throws a dazzling fete at her grand manor. But when a local woman, Heather Badcock, sips a poisoned cocktail and collapses, the village's peace shatters. Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster, unravels a chilling mystery. Marina's secret past, a hidden child from a wartime scandal, drives her to murder, silencing Heather and her probing secretary Ella with deadly precision. As the truth cracks like a mirror, will Marple stop a desperate killer before another life is lost? Chapter 1. The Fate at Gossington Hall. The village of St. Mary Mead, that pocket of rural England where time seemed to dawdle, was astir with an excitement it seldom knew. Gossington Hall, once the staid residence of Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, had changed hands, and its new occupants, a celebrated American film star, Marina Gregg, and her director husband, Jason Rudd, had thrown open its gates for a grand fete in aid of the St. John Ambulance. The July sun burnished the lawns, and the air hummed with anticipation, for Marina herself, a creature of silver screen legend, was to make an appearance. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her small garden with its neatly clipped hedges, observed the preparations through her window. At 80, her body was frail, but her eyes, bright and bird-like, missed nothing. She wore a black lace cap and a shawl over her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale pink scarf. From her vantage point, she could see the stream of villagers and strangers, some from as far as Much Benham, trudging toward the hall, their voices carrying snatches of gossip about the famous new residents. "It's quite the to-do, isn't it, Jane?" remarked Mrs. Bantry, who had dropped by for tea and now sat opposite, her round face flushed with the day's warmth. Dolly Bantry, widowed but undimmed, retained a proprietary fondness for Gossington Hall, though she now lived in the more modest East Lodge. "Marina Gregg! I saw her in Love's Last Echo, you know. Such glamour! And to think she's here, in our little village." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Glamour," she said, "has a way of stirring things up. People behave oddly around it." Her needles paused as she glanced toward the hall, where a marquee was being erected, its white canvas flapping like a sail. She had heard much about Marina Gregg, her beauty, her tempestuous marriages, her recent return to England after years to Hollywood. Jason Rudd, her fifth husband, was said to be brilliant but reserved, a man who preferred shadows to spotlights. Miss Marple, who had a knack for sensing undercurrents, wondered what had drawn such a pair to St. Mary Mead. The conversation turned to the fate's organizer, Heather Badcock, a woman of boundless energy and middling tact. Heather, who lived in one of the new bungalows on the edge of the village, was secretary of the St. John Ambulance Committee, and had thrown herself into the event with zeal. "She's everywhere," Mrs. Bantry said, stirring her tea. "Always talking, always organising. I dare say she'll have Marina Gregg autographing her programme before the day's out." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. She knew Heather Badcock, not intimately, but as one knows the fixtures of village life. Heather was in her late 40s, with a broad, pleasant face and a voice that carried. She had a habit of recounting her life's small triumphs at length, a trait Miss Marple found revealing. "Heather is enthusiastic," she murmured. "Such people often see more than they realize, or say more than they should." Mrs. Bantry chuckled. "Oh, Jane, you make her sound positively sinister. She's harmless, surely, just a bit of a busybody." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But busybodies, Dolly, have a way of stumbling into trouble." She set her knitting aside and rose, leaning on her stick as she moved to the window. The village green was alive with activity. Children darted about, clutching balloons, while stalls offered jams, knitted goods, and the inevitable tombola. At the hall's gates, a small crowd had gathered, hoping for a glimpse of Marina Gregg. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a figure in a bright blue dress. Heather Badcock, no doubt, bustling about with her clipboard, her laughter ringing out. Fate, Miss Marple sensed, would be more than a village diversion. She had lived long enough to know that gatherings of this sort, with their mix of strangers and secrets, often uncovered what lay hidden. As she returned to her chair, her mind was already at work, sorting impressions like pieces of a puzzle. "I think," she said softly, "I shall ask Cherry to pop up to the hall later. She might bring back some news." Mrs. Bantry raised an eyebrow. "News? Jane, you're not expecting anything dreadful, are you?" Miss Marple smiled, a gentle, enigmatic smile. "Not expecting, Dolly, but one must always be prepared." She picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their steady rhythm, as the sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead and the fete at Gossington Hall began. Chapter 2. A Fatal Cocktail. The sun blazed over Gossington Hall, casting dappled shadows across the manicured lawns, where the fete was in full swing. St. Mary Mead had turned out in force, their Sunday best mingling with the curious from neighbouring villages, all drawn by the promise of glimpsing Marina Gregg, the film star whose presence lent an almost surreal sheen to the familiar landscape. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass, warm scones, and the faint tang of lemonade, while a brass band played a jaunty tune near the rose garden. Stalls lined the gravel paths, offering homemade preserves, knitted tea cosies, and a lucky dip that had the children squealing with delight. At the centre of it all stood the great marquee, its white canvas billowing gently, where Marina Gregg and her husband, Jason Rudd, were to receive their guests. Miss Jane Marple, though absent from the festivities, was not far from the pulse of events. She remained in her cottage, her frail frame settled in an armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm that belied the keen activity of her mind. Cherry Baker, her young maid, had been dispatched to the fete with instructions to observe and report, for Miss Marple knew the value of a sharp pair of eyes in a crowd. Cherry, with her quick wit and knack for blending in, was an ideal emissary. As Miss Marple worked on her pink scarf, her thoughts drifted to the morning's conversation with Mrs. Bantry, who had spoken of Heather Badcock's enthusiasm and Marina Gregg's glamour. There was something about such gatherings, Miss Marple mused, that brought hidden tensions to the surface, like bubbles rising in a simmering pot. At Gossington Hall, the marquee was a hub of activity. Inside, a long table held trays of sandwiches, cakes, and a silver punch bowl filled with a daiquiri concoction that had been the talk of the village. Marina Gregg, resplendent in a pale green chiffon dress that seemed to shimmer with her every movement, stood near the table, her smile radiant, yet somehow fragile. Her golden hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, and her eyes, large and luminous, held a quality that made each villager feel, for a moment, as though they were the sole object of her attention. Jason Rudd, lean and dark-haired, hovered nearby, his expression a mix of pride and watchfulness. He wore a linen suit, impeccably tailored, but his eyes darted about, as if anticipating some unseen threat. Heather Badcock, in her bright blue dress, was in her element. She had spent weeks organising the fete, and now she moved through the marquee with the confidence of a general, her clipboard tucked under one arm. Her broad face was flushed with exertion and excitement, and her voice carried over the hum of conversation as she directed volunteers and greeted guests. "Oh, Mrs. Lucas, do try the daiquiri. It's Marina's own recipe," she called to an elderly woman who nodded politely. Heather's enthusiasm was infectious, though some villagers, like the sharp-tongued Miss Hartnell, found her relentless cheer grating. "That woman," Miss Hartnell muttered to a companion, "would talk the hind leg off a donkey." It was shortly after 3 o'clock when Heather approached Marina Gregg, her eyes shining with the fervour of a devotee. A small crowd had gathered, eager to witness the encounter between the village's busiest busybody and its most illustrious resident. Marina, who had been chatting with the vicar, turned as Heather approached, her smile unwavering. "Miss Gregg, I'm Heather Badcock," Heather began, her voice loud enough to draw attention. "I've been such a fan of yours ever since I was a girl. I met you once, you know, years ago during the war. You were doing a charity show for the troops, and I was ever so thrilled." Marina's smile held, but Mrs. Bantry, standing nearby, with a glass of lemonade, noticed a curious change in the actress's demeanour. For a fleeting moment, Marina's eyes seemed to fix on something beyond Heather, her expression freezing into one of stark, almost theatrical horror. It was as if, Mrs. Bantry later recalled, Marina had seen a spectre in the bright afternoon light. The moment passed swiftly, and Marina recovered, her voice warm as she responded, "How kind of you to remember, Mrs. Badcock. Would you care for a drink?" She gestured to the punch bowl, where a tray of pre-poured daiquiris stood, their glasses frosted from the ice. "Oh, I'd love one!" Heather exclaimed, accepting a glass with a flourish. She continued to prattle, recounting her wartime encounter with Marina in exhaustive detail, oblivious to the actress's subtle withdrawal. Marina nodded, her responses brief, while Jason Rudd stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on his wife's arm. Heather, undeterred, sipped her daiquiri and launched into another anecdote, her voice rising with enthusiasm. "And there I was, all of 16, queuing for hours just to see you." Her words cut off abruptly. Heather's face contorted, her hand clutching at her throat as the glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marquee's wooden floor. A gasp rippled through the crowd as she staggered, her eyes wide with panic. "My chest!" she gasped before collapsing in a heap, her blue dress pooling around her like spilled ink. The band faltered, and a hush fell over the marquee, broken only by a woman's scream. Dr. Haydock, a portly man with a reputation for calm under pressure, was among the guests and pushed through the crowd. He knelt beside Heather, his fingers searching for a pulse. "Someone fetch my bag!" he barked, his face grim. The vicar's wife hurried to comply, while Jason Rudd ushered Marina away, her face pale as chalk. Mrs. Bantry, rooted to the spot, watched as Dr. Haydock loosened Heather's collar, his movements swift but futile. After a moment, he sat back, on his heels, his expression sombre. "She's gone," he said quietly. "Dead." A murmur of shock swept through the marquee, followed by a flurry of questions. Dead? How? Was it a fit? Dr. Haydock rose, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the shattered glass, its contents seeping into the floorboards. Not a fit, he said, his voice low. I'd wager poison. That daiquiri. Someone must test it. He turned to a young man nearby, one of the St. John ambulance volunteers. Run to the village, lad. Get the police, and tell them to bring a doctor who knows toxicology. The fete dissolved into chaos. Villagers clustered in knots, whispering furiously, while the band packed up their instruments, their jaunty tune forgotten. Marina Gregg, now seated in a corner of the marquee, was surrounded by her entourage, a sharp-faced secretary, Ella Zielinski, and a quiet young woman, Margot Bense, who seemed to be a dresser or assistant. Jason Rudd spoke urgently to a police constable who had arrived from the village, his gestures emphatic. Mrs. Bantry, shaken but observant, noted Marina's trembling hands and the way her eyes darted about, as if searching for an escape. By the time, Cherry Baker returned to Miss Marple's cottage. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden. Cherry, her dark hair slightly askew, burst through the door, her usual composure frayed. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's awful!" she exclaimed, sinking into a chair. "Heather Badcock's dead, right there in the marquee. They're saying it's poison!" Miss Marple's needles paused, her pale blue eyes sharpening. "Poison, you say? Tell me everything, Cherry. Leave nothing out." She listened intently as Cherry recounted the afternoon's events. Heather's exuberant conversation with Marina, the daiquiri, the sudden collapse, and Dr. Haydock's grim pronouncement. Cherry, who had been near the marquee when it happened, described the crowd's panic and Marina's strange frozen moment, which she'd overheard Mrs. Bantry mention to another guest. "She looked like she'd seen something dreadful," Cherry said, her voice hushed. Mrs. Bantry said it was like Marina was staring at a ghost. "But Heather was just talking, same as always. I don't see how it could have upset her so." Miss Marple leaned back, her mind sifting through Cherry's words. Poison was no accident, not in a glass handed directly from one person to another, and that look of Marina's, described now by both Mrs. Bantry and Cherry, suggested a shock, a recognition, perhaps a fear. "Who else was near the punch bowl?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild but probing. Cherry frowned, thinking, well, Mr. Rudd was there, and that secretary, Miss Zielinski. She was fussing about with the glasses earlier, making sure everything was just so. And there was a girl, Margot, I think, hanging about, quiet-like. Oh, and the vicar was chatting with Marina just before Heather came up. But it was Marina who gave Heather the glass. I'm sure of it. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers resuming their knitting with a slow, deliberate rhythm. And the daiquiri, was it poured fresh, or taken from the tray? From the tray, Cherry said. There were dozens of glasses, all lined up. Marina just picked one and handed it over. It's mad to think it was poisoned, isn't it? I mean, who'd want to kill Heather Badcock? She was a bit much, always going on, but harmless. Harmless, Miss Marple echoed, though her tone suggested otherwise. She had known many Heathers in her time, well-meaning souls whose chatter could inadvertently touch a nerve. People talked, and in talking, they sometimes revealed what others wished to keep buried. Had Heather said something, in her flood of reminiscences, that triggered a deadly response? And why, Miss Marple wondered, had Marina Gregg looked as though the ground had shifted beneath her? As Cherry prattled on, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the mechanics of the crime. A poisoned glass on a tray suggested either a random act or a precise one, and the latter seemed more likely. Poison required intent, preparation, opportunity. Marina, as the hostess, had access to the drinks, but so, it seemed, did others in her circle. The secretary, Ella Zielinski, with her brisk efficiency, might have tampered with a glass unnoticed. Jason Rudd, protective and watchful, could have acted to shield his wife from some perceived threat. And the quiet Margot Bentz, what was her role in this drama? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the last light of day gilded the village green. The fete would be over now, its stalls dismantled, its laughter silenced by tragedy. She thought of Marina Gregg, a woman whose life was lived in the glare of public adoration, yet whose eyes, in that fleeting moment, had betrayed a private terror. And she thought of Heather Badcock, whose enthusiasm had carried her to her death. "Cherry," Miss Marple said at last, "I think you should have a cup of tea. And then perhaps you might recall if anyone else spoke to Heather just before she approached Miss Gregg. The smallest detail, you know, can be significant." Cherry nodded, accustomed to her employer's cryptic requests. As she bustled to the kitchen, Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting forgotten. A fatal cocktail, a frozen glance, a village turned upside down. St. Mary Mead was no stranger to secrets, and Miss Marple knew that this one, like a crack in a mirror, would reveal its jagged truth in time. Chapter 3. The Film Star's Shadow. The morning after the fete dawned grey and heavy, as if St. Mary Mead itself mourned the shocking turn of events at Gossington Hall. The village, usually alive with the cheerful bustle of market day, was subdued, its inhabitants clustering in doorways and at the post office, their voices low with speculation. Heather Badcock's death, poison, the whispers confirmed, had cast a pall over the community, transforming the memory of the sunlit fete into something sinister. At Miss Marple's cottage, the fire crackled softly in the grate, a counterpoint to the chill drizzle outside. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favourite armchair, her knitting idle in her lap, gazed out at the sodden garden, her mind far from the weather. She had slept little, her thoughts circling the details Cherry had brought back. Heather's collapse, the poisoned decory, and most intriguingly, Marina Gregg's frozen expression, described so vividly by Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple knew the power of such moments, fleeting glimpses into the human soul, when masks slipped and truths flickered like shadows. Marina, the glamorous film star, was at the heart of this puzzle, and Miss Marple sensed that the key to Heather's death lay not in the village, but in the glittering, treacherous world Marina inhabited. By mid-morning, the arrival of Inspector Dermot Craddock interrupted her reverie. Craddock, a lean man in his 40s with a courteous manner and sharp grey eyes, was no stranger to St. Mary Mead. A nephew of Miss Marple's old friend Sir Henry Clithering, he had crossed paths with her before, and though he valued her insights, he sometimes found her gentle roundabout manner exasperating. Today, however, he was all business, his notebook open as he settled into a chair, declining tea with a polite wave. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he began, his tone brisk. "I'm sure you've heard about the tragedy at Gossington Hall. Heather Badcock poisoned, right in the middle of the fete. It's a nasty business, and I'd value your thoughts. You know the village better than most." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained grave. "Dear Inspector, I'm only an old woman who hears gossip, but I'm happy to help. Tell me, what have you learned so far?" Craddock leaned forward, his voice lowering. The daiquiri was laced with hyoscine, a powerful alkaloid. Dr. Haydock's preliminary tests confirmed it, and the lab in Much Benham is analysing the glass fragments. The poison was in the drink Marina Gregg handed to Mrs. Badcock, no question. But here's the rub. Marina insists the cocktail was meant for her. She says she's had threats before. Cranks, obsessed fans, that sort of thing. Jason Rudd backs her up, says it's not the first time someone's tried to harm her. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking, a soothing counterpoint to Craddock's intensity. "And do you believe her, Inspector, that the poison was intended for Miss Gregg?" Craddock hesitated, his brow furrowing. "It's plausible. She's a star, after all. People like that attract trouble. But it doesn't sit right. The glass was on a tray, one of dozens, and Marina picked it up herself. If someone wanted to kill her, they'd need to be sure she got the right one. It feels too chancy. And then there's Mrs. Badcock. Why her if it was a mistake? She was nobody special, just a village woman with a loud voice and a knack for organising." "Nobody special," Miss Marple echoed softly, her tone thoughtful. "Yet she is dead, Inspector, and that makes her very special indeed. People are rarely killed by accident, you know. There is usually a reason, even if it's buried deep." She paused, her gaze drifting to the window, where rain pattered against the panes. What did Miss Gregg say about the moment she handed over the drink? Craddock flipped a page in his notebook. She was vague, shaken up. Said Mrs. Badcock was talking a mile a minute, going on about meeting her years ago during a wartime show. Marina claims she barely listened, just smiled and handed her the daiquiri to be polite. Jason Rudd was more forthcoming. He said Marina's been under strain lately. Nerves, the pressure of her comeback. He thinks the poison was meant to scare her, maybe disrupt their new life here. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "And yet, Inspector, Mrs. Bantry mentioned something curious. She saw Miss Gregg's face during that conversation with Mrs. Badcock, and she described it as frozen. Like a mask of horror, she said, as if Marina had seen something dreadful. Does that sound like a woman merely irritated by a talkative fan?" Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Bantry told me the same. I pressed Marina about it, but she brushed it off. Said she was tired, overwhelmed by the crowd. I'm not convinced. There's something she's not telling me, or something she doesn't want to face." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've got my work cut out, Miss Marple. Gossington Hall is crawling with people, secretaries, assistants, hangers-on. Any one of them could have tampered with that drink. And the village isn't helping. Half the people I've spoken to think it's a Hollywood plot. The other half swear Heather Badcock had no enemies." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her fingers pausing over her knitting. "Villages, Inspector, are full of secrets, but they are also full of eyes. Someone saw something, even if they don't yet know its importance. Tell me about Miss Gregg's household. Who surrounds her?" Craddock consulted his notes. There's Jason Rudd, her husband. He's a director, sharp as a tack, but protective to a fault. He watches Marina like she's made of glass. Then there's Ella Zielinski, her secretary. Efficient, a bit cold, handles all the correspondence and schedules. Margot Bence, a photographer and dresser, seems to be a personal assistant of sorts. She's quiet, keeps to herself. There's also a cook, a maid and a driver. But they weren't near the marquee during the incident. I've got my men checking their backgrounds, but it's slow going. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the names. And Miss Gregg, herself. What do you make of her? Craddock hesitated, choosing his words carefully. She's magnetic. You can't take your eyes off her, even when she's just sitting there looking fragile. But there's an edge to her, like she's always performing. I don't know if it's guilt, fear, or something else, but she's not giving me the whole story. Rudd's no better. He's loyal. But I get the sense he's hiding something to protect her. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained crisp. People often hide what they fear to lose, Inspector. Miss Gregg has built a life on her image, and such lives are fragile. A single crack can bring everything down. She leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle but probing. Have you considered what Mrs. Badcock might have said to provoke such a reaction? Her chatter, I'm told, was about a wartime meeting with Miss Gregg. Perhaps there's something in that memory, something Miss Gregg did not wish to hear. Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful. It's worth looking into. I'll have someone dig into Mrs. Badcock's past, see if there's a connection to Marina beyond a fan's obsession. But it's a long shot. Heather was a nobody. Housewife, a volunteer, always in the thick of village doings, but nothing to suggest she'd cross paths with a film star in any meaningful way. Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. Long shots, Inspector, are sometimes the ones that hit the mark. People like Mrs. Badcock often know more than they realize. They talk, they listen, they remember. And sometimes they stumble upon a secret that others would kill to keep. She set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. I suggest you speak to Miss Gregg again and watch her closely. Not just her words, but her silences. They often speak louder. Craddock rose, tucking his notebook into his pocket. You've given me plenty to think about, Miss Marple. I'll keep you posted, and if you hear anything in the village, gossip, rumours, anything at all, I shall be sure to let you know, Miss Marple said, her voice mild but firm. Do take care, Inspector. Poison is a cowardly weapon, but a determined one. Whoever used it may not stop at one. As Craddock departed, the rain intensified, drumming against the cottage roof. Miss Marple remained by the window, her thoughts turning to Marina Gregg. She had seen photographs of the actress in magazines, her beauty almost otherworldly, yet there was a vulnerability in those wide eyes, a hint of something haunted. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing human nature, knew that glamour often masked pain, and that those who lived in the spotlight cast long shadows. The afternoon brought a visitor, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her coat damp and her face alight with the thrill of being near a mystery. She settled into the armchair vacated by Craddock, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Jane, it's simply ghastly," she exclaimed, accepting a cup of tea from Cherry, who hovered eagerly. "Heather Badcock, of all people! And that look on Marina Gregg's face, I can't stop thinking about it. It was as if she'd seen the devil himself, right there in the marquee. Miss Marple listened attentively as Mrs. Bantry recounted the fate in vivid detail, her memory sharpened by the shock of the tragedy. She described the marquee's festive chaos, the tray of decories glittering in the sunlight, and Heather's relentless chatter as she cornered Marina. She was going on about that wartime show, Mrs. Bantry said, her voice hushed. Something about queuing up to meet Marina, how she'd never forgotten it. And then Marina just froze. I swear, Jane, it wasn't just annoyance. It was fear or something like it. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for her knitting, though she left it untouched. Fear, she murmured. Yes, that is interesting. Did you notice anything else, Dolly? Anyone near the punch bowl, perhaps, or watching the exchange? Mrs. Bantry frowned, her brow creasing. Well, Jason Rudd was there, hovering like a hawk. And that secretary, Ella, is it? She was fussing with the glasses earlier, making sure they were all in order. I didn't see anyone tamper with anything, but it was so crowded, Jane. Anyone could have slipped something into a glass if they were clever about it. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. Ella Zielinski, the efficient secretary, Jason Rudd, the protective husband, Margot Bence, the quiet assistant, each a piece in the puzzle, each with access to the fatal cocktail. And Marina herself, whose reaction suggested a deeper connection to Heather's words. Miss Marple thought of her own village, where secrets simmered beneath polite surfaces, and of Marina's world, where fame amplified every whisper into a shout. Dolly, she said at last, you've been most helpful. I wonder if you might keep your eyes open at Gossington Hall. You're still friendly with the staff there, aren't you? A word here, a hint there. It could make all the difference. Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with mischief. You want me to snoop, Jane? Oh, I'm game. I'll pop up to the hall tomorrow, see what the maids are saying. They always know more than they let on. Miss Marple smiled, though her expression was tinged with caution. Discreetly, Dolly. We mustn't alarm anyone. Whoever did this is clever, and clever people are dangerous when cornered. As Mrs. Bantry departed, promising to report back, Miss Marple returned to her window, the rain now a steady curtain beyond the glass. She thought of Heather Badcock, whose life had ended so abruptly, and of Marina Gregg, whose fear had betrayed a hidden truth. The film star's shadow loomed large, stretching from Hollywood to this quiet village, and Miss Marple knew that somewhere within it lay the answer to a murder. Cherry, clearing the tea things, glanced at her employer. You're thinking hard, Miss Marple, she said, her tone half teasing. Got a hunch about who did it? Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Not a hunch, Cherry. A suspicion. But suspicions, like seeds, need time to grow. She reached for her knitting, the needles resuming their dance as the rain fell and the mystery of Gossington Hall deepened. Chapter 4. Heather's Tale. The drizzle that had cloaked St. Mary Mead the previous day gave way to a tentative sun, its rays piercing the clouds to gild the village's thatched roofs and cobbled lanes. Yet the brightness did little to lift the unease that lingered after Heather Badcock's death. The post office buzzed with hushed theories, and the Blue Boar's regulars debated over their pints whether a Hollywood vendetta had followed Marina Gregg to their quiet corner of England. At her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. Her mind, however, was far from idle, sifting through the fragments of the tragedy at Gossington Hall. Miss Marple had spent the morning reflecting on Inspector Craddock's visit and Mrs. Bantry's vivid account of Marina Gregg's frozen expression. The image of the film star, caught in a moment of stark horror as Heather Badcock prattled on, was a thread Miss Marple could not let go. Heather's words, it seemed, had struck a nerve, and Miss Marple knew that even the most innocuous chatter could unearth secrets better left buried. To understand the murder, she needed to understand Heather, not just the bustling village organizer, but the woman whose past might hold the key to her death. Cherry Baker, ever eager to assist, was dispatched. To gather village gossip, her sharp ears attuned to any mention of Heather Badcock. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, with her stick for support, decided to pay a call on Mrs. Lucy Adams, a long-time resident who had known Heather since her arrival in St. Mary Mead 15 years earlier. Mrs. Adams lived in a neat cottage near the church, its garden ablaze with roses despite the season's turn. As Miss Marple tapped at the door, she adjusted her lace cap, her expression one of mild curiosity, though her eyes were as keen as ever. Mrs. Adams, a stout woman with a penchant for knitting, patterns and village history, welcomed Miss Marple with a flurry of hospitality. "Oh, Miss Marple, what a dreadful business!" she exclaimed, ushering her guest into a parlour fragrant with lavender. "Heather Badcock, poisoned at the fate! I can scarce believe it. Would you take tea? I've just put the kettle on." Miss Marple accepted, settling into a chintz-covered chair. "It is shocking, Mrs. Adams," she agreed, her voice gentle. "I knew Heather only slightly, but she seemed so vital. I thought you might tell me more about her. You've lived here longer than most, and you notice things." Mrs. Adams beamed at the compliment, pouring tea with a practised hand. "Well, Heather was a good soul, no mistake, though she did talk your ear off. Came to St. Mary Mead after the war with her husband Arthur. He's a clerk at the bank in Much Benham, quiet as a mouse, not like Heather at all. She threw herself into everything, W.I., the church bazaar, the St. John ambulance. Never still, that one." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze encouraging. "And before St. Mary Mead, I believe she mentioned meeting Marina Gregg during the war. It must have been quite a story for her to recall it so vividly." Mrs. Adams nodded, her eyes bright with recollection. "Oh, yes, Heather loved that story. She'd tell anyone who'd listen how she met Marina Gregg at a charity show in 43 or 44, I forget which. It was somewhere up north, Leeds maybe. Heather was young then, just a girl, and mad for the pictures. She queued for hours to see Marina, who was doing a turn for the troops. Heather said she got right up to her, shook her hand, and Marina was ever so kind. It was the highlight of her life, she said. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for her knitting, though her hands remained folded. "Leeds, you say? That's interesting. Did Heather ever mention working during the war? Many young women did, you know, in hospitals or factories." Mrs. Adams frowned, stirring her tea. "Now you mention it, she did say something about helping out at a hospital. Not proper nursing, mind, just fetching and carrying, making tea for the staff. She was only 16 or so, too young for much else. I don't recall where, but it was near where she grew up, before she married Arthur and moved here." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained placid. A hospital, even as a volunteer, meant access to records, conversations, perhaps secrets. And did she ever connect her hospital work to her meeting with Marina Gregg? Or mention seeing her elsewhere? Mrs. Adams shook her head. Not that I recall. It was always the charity show she talked about. Mind you, Heather wasn't one for keeping things to herself. If she'd known anything juicy about Marina Gregg, she'd have told half the village by now. She paused, her face clouding. Do you think, Miss Marple, that her talking about that meeting got her killed? It seems so far-fetched. Miss Marple smiled, a gentle, enigmatic smile. Far-fetched things, Mrs. Adams, are often the ones that matter. Heather's stories may have held more than she realized. Thank you for your time. You've been most helpful. As Miss Marple made her slow way back to her cottage, her mind was busy. Heather's wartime encounter with Marina Gregg, however, brief, had left an impression deep enough to resurface at the fete, and Marina's reaction suggested it was no mere fan's tale. The hospital connection, vague as it was, intrigued her. Hospitals were places of birth and death, of confidential files and whispered confidences. Had Heather, in her youthful innocence, stumbled across something Marina wished forgotten? Back at the cottage, Cherry returned, her cheeks pink from the brisk walk. I've been all over, Miss Marple, she said, shedding her coat. The village is in a right state about Heather. Most folk think it was a mistake, that the poison was meant for Marina Gregg. But I talked to Miss Hartnell, and she's got a different idea. Says Heather was too nosy for her own good, always poking into people's business. Reckons she might have upset someone without knowing it. Miss Marple nodded, settling into her armchair. Miss Hartnell is not entirely wrong, Cherry. Heather's curiosity could have been her undoing. Did you learn anything else about her habits? Her friends, perhaps, or her work with the St. John ambulance? Cherry perched on the sofa, her eyes bright. Well, I stopped by the vicarage, and Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, was full of it. She said Heather was always at the ambulance meetings, taking notes, planning events. She'd talk about her life non-stop, her childhood, her Arthur, that time she met Marina Gregg. Mrs. Price said it got a bit much, but Heather meant no harm. Oh, and there was a new girl at the meetings lately, a photographer type from Gossington Hall. Margot, I think. She didn't say much, just listened while Heather went on. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Margot Bence, you mean? The assistant to Miss Gregg? That's her, Cherry confirmed. Mrs. Price said she seemed out of place, like she was there to keep an eye on things. Heather tried to draw her out, asking about Marina and the film world, but Margot just smiled and said little. Bit odd, don't you think, her turning up at those meetings? Very odd, Miss Marple murmured, her mind racing. Margot Bence, quiet and watchful, had been near the marquee during the fete, and now she was attending village meetings where Heather held court. Was she merely curious, or was there a purpose to her presence? Miss Marple thought of Marina's entourage, Jason Rudd, Ella Zielinski, Margot Bence, each a potential player in this deadly drama. Cherry, you've done splendidly. Now, I wonder if you might ask Mrs. Price for the dates of those meetings. It could be useful. Cherry grinned, sensing a mission. Right you are, Miss Marple. I'll pop back tomorrow. She hesitated, then added, Do you think Heather knew something dangerous? Something that got her killed? Miss Marple's eyes met Cherry's, steady and grave. I think, Cherry, that Heather's tongue may have been her greatest asset and her greatest peril. People talk, and in talking they sometimes touch a wound. We must find out what wound that was. The afternoon brought a second visitor. Inspector Craddock, his face etched with the strain of a case that was proving more complex than he'd hoped. He accepted tea this time, settling into the chair opposite Miss Marple with a sigh. "I've been up at Gossington Hall all morning," he said, his voice weary. "Marina Gregg is a wreck. Or playing one, hard to tell. She's sticking to her story that the poison was meant for her, but I'm not buying it." The lab confirmed the hyoscine was in Heather's glass alone, not the punch bowl or any other drink. Someone targeted her specifically. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a soothing rhythm. "That is significant, Inspector. A single glass, poisoned and delivered with precision. It suggests not only intent, but opportunity. Who had access to the tray before Miss Gregg handed over the drink?" Craddock consulted his notebook. "The tray was prepared by Ella Zielinski, who poured the daiquiris about 20 minutes before the incident. She swears she left the tray on the table untouched while she dealt with other duties. Jason Rudd was in and out of the marquee, keeping an eye on Marina. Margot Bence was there too, arranging some props for a photo session Marina was to do later. The vicar and a few villagers were milling about, but no one saw anything suspicious. It's like the poison appeared out of thin air." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Nothing appears out of thin air, Inspector. Someone was clever, and clever people leave traces, even if they're faint. Have you learned anything about Mrs. Badcock's past? Her connection to Miss Gregg, perhaps?" Craddock nodded, flipping a page. "I've got a man looking into it, but it's slow going. Heather was born in Yorkshire, grew up in a small town, near Leeds. She worked as a volunteer aide in a hospital during the war, mostly menial tasks. That's where she met Marina Gregg, at a charity event in the area. We're trying to pin down the details, but records from that time are spotty. So far, it looks like a chance encounter, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her voice remained mild. "Chance encounters, Inspector, can have long shadows. Heather was young, impressionable, and in a hospital, where secrets are kept and sometimes overheard. I suggest you look closely at that period, 1943 or 1944 near Leeds, and perhaps ask Miss Bence why she attended the St. John ambulance meetings. Her presence there is curious." Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful. "You think Margot's involved? She's a bit of a mystery, I'll grant you. Keeps her cards close, unlike Ella, who's all business, or Rudd, who's practically Marina's shadow." Miss Marple smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "Shadows, Inspector, are revealing. They show us where the light falls and where it does not. Miss Bence may be watching, or she may be watched. Either way, she is part of this picture." Craddock rose, his notebook tucked away. "I'll follow up on the hospital and Margot, and I'll keep you posted, Miss Marple. If you hear anything, I shall be sure to tell you," Miss Marple said, her tone firm but kind. "Take care, Inspector. A poisoner is a patient creature, and patience can be dangerous." As Craddock departed, Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting forgotten. She thought of Heather Badcock, whose life had been snuffed out by a single glass, and of Marina Gregg, whose fear had betrayed a hidden truth. The hospital in Leeds, the wartime show, the quiet presence of Margot Bence. These were threads in a tapestry Miss Marple was beginning to weave. She thought, too, of her own village, where gossip was currency, and memories lingered like dust in an attic. Heather's tale, she sensed, was not yet fully told, and its next chapter might reveal the crack in Marina's carefully polished mirror. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the past, where secrets waited to be uncovered. Chapter 5. The American Connection. The village of St. Mary Mead, though outwardly serene under the late July sun, simmered with an undercurrent of unease. Heather Badcock's death had unsettled its rhythms, and the presence of a film star, like Marina Gregg at Gossington Hall, only fueled the whispers that darted from the butcher's to the vicarage. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her cottage, felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. Her knitting lay untouched, the pink scarf a soft heap in her basket as she gazed out at the garden, where roses nodded in the breeze. Her mind, sharp and restless, turned over the threads of the case. Heather's wartime tale, Marina's frozen horror, and the poisoned daiquiri that had ended a life with chilling precision. Miss Marple had spent the morning sifting through the information gleaned from Mrs. Adams and Cherry Baker. Heather's brief stint as a hospital aide near Leeds, coupled with her encounter with Marina Gregg at a wartime charity show, suggested a connection that was more than a fan's fleeting brush with fame. The hospital, Miss Marple mused, was a place of secrets, births, deaths, and confidences whispered in quiet corridors. Had Heather, in her youthful curiosity, overheard something that Marina Gregg could not afford to have resurfaced? The question gnawed at her, and she resolved to share her thoughts with Inspector Craddock when next they met. As if summoned by her musings, Craddock arrived shortly after luncheon, his face etched with the strain of a case that grew more tangled by the hour. He settled into the armchair opposite Miss Marple, his notebook open, though his pen remained idle. "Miss Marple," he began, his tone a mix of respect and exasperation, "this business at Gossington Hall is like trying to unravel a knot in the dark. I've got new information, but it's raising more questions than answers. I'd be grateful for your perspective." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained grave. "I'm only an old woman, Inspector, but I'm happy to listen. What have you discovered?" Craddock leaned forward, his voice low. "We've been digging into Marina Gregg's past, as you suggested, focusing on the early 1940s when Heather Badcock claimed to have met her. Marina was in England then, performing for the troops, but her career began in America. In 1942, she was married to Robert Truscott, a Hollywood producer with a reputation for ruthlessness. They had a daughter, born in 43, but the marriage fell apart soon after. The child was given up for adoption, and the whole affair was hushed up. Hollywood's good at that sort of thing. Truscott died years ago, and Marina never spoke of the child publicly." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for her knitting, though her hands remained folded. "A child," she murmured, her mind racing. "That is significant, Inspector. A secret like that, buried but not forgotten, could be a powerful motive. And Heather Badcock, where does she fit into this?" Craddock flipped a page in his notebook. "That's where it gets interesting. Heather was working as a volunteer, aide at St. Anselm's Hospital near Leeds in 1943. It was a small facility, mostly for maternity cases and minor surgeries. Marina's charity show was in Leeds that same year, and we've confirmed Heather attended. But here's the kicker. St. Anselm's was where Marina gave birth, under an assumed name, Mary Crane, to avoid scandal. The records are incomplete, but a nurse's log mentions a Miss Crane delivering a girl in October 43. Heather, as an aide, had access to the wards, the files, even the gossip among the staff. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her voice soft but probing. And you think Heather might have known about the birth, or recognized Marina's alias? Craddock nodded, his expression grim. It's possible. She was young, eager, and from what we've heard, always chatting with the nurses. If she saw Marina at the hospital or heard her name mentioned, she might have put 2 and 2 together when she met her at the show. At the fete, when she started reminiscing, she could have said something that tipped Marina off, something that made Marina think her secret was at risk. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind weaving the threads together. A child given up in secrecy, a young girl in a hospital, a chance encounter that lingered in memory. It would explain Miss Gregg's reaction, she said, her tone thoughtful. Mrs. Bantry described her as frozen, as if she'd seen a spectre. If Heather's words stirred a memory of that time, a secret Marina believed buried, it could have sparked fear, or worse, a decision to act. Craddock sighed, running a hand through his hair. But it's all conjecture, Miss Marple. We've no proof Heather knew anything, or that Marina thought she did. And the poison, hyoscine, in a single glass, required planning, not panic. Whoever did this was cold, calculated. Marina's fragile, yes, but a murderer? I'm not sure. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Fragility, Inspector, can be a mask. People kill to protect what they cannot bear to lose. Reputation, love, a carefully built life. Marina Gregg has spent years crafting her image. A scandal, even an old one, could shatter it. She paused, her gaze drifting to the window, where the sun glinted off the wet grass. Have you traced the child? She would be grown now, perhaps unaware of her origins. Craddock shook his head. We're trying, but adoption records from that time are a mess. The agency that handled it closed in the 50s, and the couple who adopted the girl are dead. We know she was raised in England, but beyond that, it's a needle in a haystack. I've got a man chasing leads in Leeds, but it'll take time. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the information. Time, Inspector, is what we must use wisely. Tell me, what of the others at Gossington Hall? Mr. Rudd, Miss Zielinski, Miss Bence, have they shed any light? Craddock's brow furrowed. Jason Rudd is devoted to Marina, almost to a fault. He's been cooperative, but I get the sense he's shielding her, maybe from herself. Ella Zielinski is a machine, organizes everything, answers questions with clipped precision, but gives nothing away. Margot Bence is the odd one. She's polite, quiet, but there's a hardness to her, like she's seen more than she lets on. I asked about her background, and she said she's worked with Marina for years, mostly as a photographer. I'm having her checked, but so far, nothing. Stands out. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her voice remained mild. Miss Bence interests me, Inspector. Her presence at the St. John ambulance meetings, as Cherry mentioned, suggests curiosity, or surveillance. Perhaps she knew Heather's habits, her tendency to talk. It would be worth asking if she was at the hospital in Leeds, or knew of Marina's past. Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful. "I'll look into it, but the mechanics of the poisoning are driving me mad. The tray of daiquiris was under Ella's watch, but dozens of people were in the marquee. Anyone could have slipped the hyoscine into a glass. But how did they ensure Heather got it? Marina handed it to her, but she picked it at random, or so she claims." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if tracing an invisible pattern. "Randomness, Inspector, is rarely what it seems. A clever person can make chance look deliberate, or deliberation look like chance. Consider the tray. How long was it unattended? And who was closest to Marina when she chose the glass?" Craddock frowned, flipping back through his notes. Ella poured the drinks about 20 minutes before, then left the tray on the table while she dealt with a guest list. Jason was nearby, keeping an eye on the crowd. Margot was arranging props, but she was in and out. The vicar and a few villagers were milling about, but no one saw anything odd. "It's like the poison materialized." Miss Marple smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "Nothing materializes, Inspector. Someone was quick, and someone was bold. Hyoscine is not a common poison. It suggests knowledge, perhaps medical or chemical. Have you checked the backgrounds of those at Gossington Hall for such expertise?" Craddock nodded, his pen moving swiftly. "We're looking into it. Ella studied chemistry at university, but that's as far as we've got. The hospital angle might help. Heather's time there could point to someone with access to drugs, like hyoscine." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle but firm. "And do not overlook the human side, Inspector. Marina's secret, if Heather knew it, would have been a threat not just to her, but to those who depend on her husband, her staff, even her legacy. People kill for love, for loyalty, as much as for fear. Watch them all and watch their silences." Craddock rose, tucking his notebook away. "You've given me plenty to chew on, Miss Marple. I'll follow up on the hospital, Margot, and the adoption. If you hear anything in the village, she'll let you know, Miss Marple," said her voice steady. "Be careful, Inspector. A secret worth killing for is a secret worth killing again to keep." As Craddock departed, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cottage floor. Miss Marple remained by the window, her thoughts turning to the American connection, the child born in secrecy, the hospital in Leeds, the life Marina Gregg had left behind. She thought of her own village, where past and present intertwined like ivy, and of Heather Badcock, whose innocent reminiscences had triggered a deadly response. The arrival of Mrs. Bantry, her face alight with gossip, broke Miss Marple's reverie. "Jane, you'll never guess what I've heard," she exclaimed, shedding her coat and settling into a chair. "I was at the hall this morning, chatting with the cook, Mrs. Dixon. She says Marina's been in a state ever since the fete. Hardly eats jumps at shadows, and Jason Rudd's been on the phone with America, late at night, talking in whispers. Mrs. Dixon couldn't hear much, but she caught the word adoption. Doesn't that send shivers down your spine?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though. Her expression remained placid. "It does, Dolly. It suggests Mr. Rudd is concerned about something in Marina's past. Did Mrs. Dixon mention anyone else? Miss Zielinski, perhaps, or Miss Bentz?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, her eyes wide. "She said Ella's been snappish, even more than usual. And Margot's been taking photographs around the hall, but not for any film work. Just odd corners, like she's documenting something. Mrs. Dixon thinks it's peculiar, but then everything's peculiar up there now." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if tracing the edges of a puzzle. "Peculiar indeed. Dolly, you've been invaluable. If you could keep an ear out for more about those phone calls, or Margot's photographs, it might help." Mrs. Bantry grinned, relishing her role. "I'll be your spy, Jane. Anything for a bit of excitement. But do you think Marina did it? Poisoned Heather, I mean?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "I think, Dolly, that Marina is at the heart of this, whether by her hand or another's. The truth lies in her past, and Heather's tale touched it like a spark to tinder." She paused, her gaze drifting to the garden, where the roses glowed in the fading light. "We must be patient, but not idle. The American connection, as Inspector Craddock might call it, is where we'll find our answers." As Mrs. Bantry departed, promising to report any further tidbits, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind weaving the threads of the case. The child, the hospital, the poison, the fear in Marina's eyes, these were pieces of a mosaic, and Miss Marple knew that with time the pattern would emerge. She thought of Heather Badcock, whose life had ended in a moment of careless chatter, and of Marina Gregg, whose secrets cast a shadow that reached across an ocean. The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing St. Mary Mead in twilight, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the past, where the seeds of murder had been sown. Chapter 6. A Study in Motives. The late July days in St. Mary Mead unfolded with a deceptive calm. The village's green lanes and stone walls bathed in sunlight that belied the shadow cast by Heather Badcock's death. The fate at Gossington Hall, once a topic of eager anticipation, was now spoken of in hushed tones, its memory tainted by the poison that had claimed a life. At her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the open window, the scent of lavender drifting in from the garden. Her knitting lay idle, the pink scarf a soft heap in its basket, as her mind turned over the growing tapestry of the case. The American connection, Marina Gregg's secret child, born in a Leeds hospital where Heather Badcock had worked, had added a new thread, one that suggested a motive as old as human nature, the desperate need to protect a hidden truth. Miss Marple's thoughts were sharpened by the details. Inspector Craddock had shared the hyoscine in a single glass, Marina's claim that the poison was meant for her, and the tantalizing possibility that Heather's wartime reminiscences had stirred a dangerous memory. Yet the mechanics of the crime, how the poison was administered with such precision, remained elusive, and Miss Marple knew that understanding the who required understanding the why. Motives, she mused, were like currents beneath a placid surface, invisible but powerful, and to uncover them she needed to delve deeper into the lives of those surrounding Marina Gregg. The morning brought a welcome visitor, her nephew, Raymond West, a writer whose penchant for modern ideas was tempered by a grudging respect for his aunt's insight. Raymond, on a brief visit to St. Mary Mead, breezed into the cottage with his usual energy, his tweed jacket slightly rumpled from the train. "Aunt Jane," he said, settling into a chair, "you're in the thick of it again, aren't you? The whole village is buzzing about this murder. Poison at a fete. It's straight out of one of my novels, only dreadfully real." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained grave. Real, indeed, Raymond, and more complex than fiction, I fear. You've heard about poor Heather Badcock. Raymond nodded, his curiosity piqued. The talk of the Blue Boar. They say she was poisoned right under Marina Gregg's nose. Quite a scandal for a film star. Do you think it was a Hollywood plot, Aunt Jane? Some jealous rival, perhaps? Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Hollywood is far away, Raymond, but human nature is the same everywhere. People kill for reasons that are deeply personal. Love, fear, shame. I suspect the answer lies closer to home, in the lives of those at Gossington Hall. She paused, her gaze drifting to the garden, where a blackbird hopped among the roses. Tell me, Raymond, you know something of the film world. What sort of woman is Marina Gregg? Beyond the glamour, I mean. Raymond leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Marina? She's a legend, of course. Beauty, talent, the lot. But she's had a rough go of it. Multiple marriages, breakdowns, scandals swept under the rug. She's fragile, they say, prone to nerves, but a fighter. Her comeback to England is a big deal. New films, new husband, new life. If someone threatened that, she'd protect it. Fiercely, I imagine. So would those around her. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away his words. Fiercely, yes. And those around her, her husband, her secretary, her assistant, would they kill to protect her, do you think? Raymond's eyes widened. You're thinking one of them did it, not Marina herself? Miss Marple's fingers twitched as if reaching for her knitting. I'm thinking, Raymond, that motives are like threads in a tapestry. Each person at Gossington Hall has a reason to wish Heather Badcock silent, if she knew something dangerous. We must study those motives to see which thread leads to murder. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but probing. Suppose Heather stumbled upon a secret. Say, a child Marina gave up years ago. Who would be most threatened by that secret coming to light? Raymond frowned, considering. Well, Marina, obviously. Her image is everything. Scandal could ruin her. Come back. Her husband, Jason Rudd, too. He staked his career on her success. A secretary might worry about her job, I suppose, if the household fell apart. And an assistant, well, that depends on how loyal she is, or what she stands to lose. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her voice remained mild. Precisely, Raymond. Loyalty, ambition, fear. These are the currents we must follow. Now, let us talk of something else. Your new book, perhaps. Raymond, though eager to discuss the murder, obliged, and their conversation turned to lighter matters. But Miss Marple's mind remained on the case, her nephew's words echoing her own suspicions. The motives at Gossington Hall were tangled, and to untangle them, she needed more than village gossip. She needed facts, and for that, she relied on Inspector Craddock. Craddock arrived in the early afternoon, his face a map of frustration and determination. He accepted tea from Cherry, who hovered with ill-concealed curiosity, and settled opposite Miss Marple, his notebook open. Miss Marple, he began, I've been digging deeper, as you suggested, and it's a minefield. The Leeds hospital records are patchy, but we've confirmed Heather was at St. Anselm's in 1943, the same time Marina gave birth under the alias Mary Crane. There's no direct evidence Heather knew about the child, but she was in the maternity ward often, running errands, chatting with nurses. It's not a stretch to think she overheard something. Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked softly. "And the child, Inspector? Any progress there?" Craddock sighed, flipping a page. "Slow. The adoption was handled privately through a small agency that's long gone. The couple who took the girl, a Mr. and Mrs. Ellison, raised her in Kent, but they died in a car crash 10 years ago. The daughter, Margaret Ellison, would be about 22 now. We're trying to trace her, but it's like chasing a ghost. She could be anywhere, and she may not even know she's adopted." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her voice thoughtful. "A ghost, indeed. But ghosts have a way of haunting, Inspector, especially when secrets are at stake. If Heather's chatter at the fete hinted at that adoption, it could have alarmed Marina, or someone close to her. Have you spoken to the household again? Mr. Rudd, perhaps, or Miss Zielinski?" Craddock nodded, his pen moving swiftly. "I've interviewed them all, and it's like pulling teeth. Jason Rudd is polite but guarded. He insists Marina's been targeted before. Letters, threats, the usual fan nonsense. He says the fate was a risk, but Marina wanted to win over the village. Ella Zielinski is a brick wall, answers every question, but it's all surface. She was near the daiquiri tray, but swears she didn't touch it after pouring. Margot Bence is the strangest. She's cooperative, but there's a distance to her, like she's watching from the sidelines. I asked about the St. John ambulance meetings, and she said she went out of curiosity to see village life. I don't buy it." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Nor do I, Inspector. Miss Bence's presence at those meetings, where Heather was so vocal, suggests more than idle interest. Perhaps she was gauging Heather's knowledge, or reporting back to someone. Have you checked her past? Her connection to Marina?" Craddock frowned, consulting his notes. "Margot's been with Marina for 5 years, mostly as a photographer, sometimes as a personal assistant. Before that, she worked in London, doing freelance photography. We're looking into her earlier years, but it's slow. She's got no criminal record, no obvious link to Leeds or the hospital. Still, there's something about her. Those eyes, like she's seen too much." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. "Eyes, Inspector, are windows to the soul. Miss Bence may have seen much, or know much. And the poison, any progress on how it was administered?" Craddock's frustration surfaced, his voice tight. "That's the devil of it. The hyoscine was in Heather's glass, and only hers. The tray was on the table for about 20 minutes, accessible to anyone, in the marquee. Ella poured the drinks, but she was distracted by guests. Jason was nearby, keeping an eye on Marina. Margot was in and out, setting up her camera. The vicar, a few villagers, even the band members were close enough to tamper with a glass, but no one saw anything. Marina picked the glass herself, handed it to Heather. "Random," she says, "but I can't shake the feeling it wasn't random at all." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze distant. "Randomness, Inspector, is a convenient cloak for intent. Suppose the glass was marked, not visibly, but in some subtle way. A smudge, a tilt, a placement on the tray. A clever person could guide Marina's hand without her knowing. Or suppose the poison was added after she chose the glass, in the moment of distraction when Heather was talking." Craddock's eyes widened, his pen poised. "After? But how?" Marina was holding the glass, and Heather drank it almost at once. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, a gentle, knowing smile. People, Inspector, are easily distracted by chatter, especially someone like Heather, who commanded attention. A quick hand, a sleight of movement, it's not impossible. Consider those closest to Marina at that moment. Mr. Rudd, perhaps, or Miss Zielinski, or even Miss Bence, lingering nearby. One of them had opportunity and motive. Craddock jotted furiously, his expression a mix of scepticism and intrigue. It's a stretch, Miss Marple, but I'll look into it. We're checking the tray for fingerprints, smudges, anything. And I'm having the household's backgrounds combed for medical knowledge. Hyoscine isn't something you pick up at the chemist. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. And do not forget the motives, Inspector. Marina's secret, if Heather knew it, threatened her world, her career, her marriage, her peace. Mr. Rudd, as her protector, might act to shield her. Miss Zielinski, whose livelihood depends on Marina, could fear the fallout of a scandal. And Miss Bence, her loyalty or her own secrets, might drive her to desperate measures. Study their motives and the method will follow. Craddock rose, tucking his notebook away. You've got a way of making the impossible seem plausible, Miss Marple. I'll dig into Margot's past, check the tray, and press Marina again. If you hear anything, I shall be sure to tell you, Miss Marple said, her tone steady. Take care, Inspector. A poisoner is a shadow, and shadows move quickly. As Craddock departed, the afternoon light softened, casting a golden glow over the cottage. Miss Marple remained by the window, her thoughts turning to the study of motives. She thought of Marina Gregg, whose beauty masked a fragile core, and of Jason Rudd, whose devotion seemed both shield and chain, Ella Zielinski, with her cold efficiency, and Margot Bence, with her watchful eyes. Each had a stake in Marina's world, each a reason to fear Heather's careless words. The arrival of Mrs. Bantry, her face alight with fresh gossip, broke Miss Marple's reverie. "Jane, you'll want to hear this," she exclaimed, shedding her hat and settling into a chair. "I was at the hall this morning, poking about as you suggested. The maid, Jenny, says Ella Zielinski's been acting odd, snapping at everyone, locking herself in her room, and Jason Rudd's been pacing the library at all hours, like a caged lion." Jenny overheard him muttering about the past staying buried. "Doesn't that make your skin crawl?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained placid. "It does, Dolly. It suggests Mr. Rudd is troubled by something old, something tied to Marina's secret. Did Jenny mention Miss Bence?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, her eyes wide. "She said Margot's been photographing the hall's grounds, not just for publicity. Old corners like the stables and the walled garden. Jenny thinks it's strange, like she's looking for something. Oh, and Ella was furious when she caught Margot at it, told her to stick to her duties." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if tracing a pattern. "Strange, indeed. Miss Bence's photographs may be more than art, Dolly. They could be a search or a record. Keep listening, and let me know what else Jenny says." Mrs. Bantry grinned, relishing her role. "I'm your eyes and ears, Jane. But do you think it's one of them? Rudd, Ella, Margot, someone in that house?" Miss Marple's lips curved, faintly. "I think, Dolly, that motives are like mirrors, reflecting what lies beneath. One of them saw Heather as a threat and acted to silence her. We must study their reflections to find the truth." She paused, her gaze drifting to the garden where the roses glowed in the fading light. Patience, Dolly, and watchfulness. The motives will reveal themselves. As Mrs. Bantry departed, promising further reports, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind weaving the threads of the case. The child, the hospital, the poison, the motives, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that with time the picture would emerge. She thought of Heather Badcock, whose life had ended in a moment of innocent chatter, and of Marina Gregg, whose secrets had cast a deadly shadow. The sun dipped low, bathing St. Mary Mead in twilight, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the study of motives where the heart of murder lay waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 7. The Frozen Moment. The golden days of late July gave way to a sultry August in St. Mary Mead, where the air hung heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and the weight of unanswered questions. Heather Badcock's death at the Gossington Hall fate lingered like a stubborn fog, its mystery deepening with each passing day. The village, though outwardly resuming its routines, buzzed with speculation, the Blue Boar and the post office serving as hubs for theories ranging from Hollywood conspiracies to local grudges. At her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the open window, a light shawl over her shoulders despite the warmth. Her knitting lay untouched, the pink scarf a soft heap in its basket, as her mind sifted through the intricate web of the case, the American connection. Marina Gregg's secret child, born in a Leeds hospital where Heather had worked as a young aide, had sharpened Miss Marple's focus. Inspector Craddock's findings suggested that Heather's wartime reminiscences at the fete might have stirred a dangerous memory, one that Marina, or someone close to her, could not afford to have exposed. Yet the precision of the poisoning, with hyoscine in a single daiquiri, pointed to a calculated mind, and Miss Marple knew that to unravel the who, she must first clarify the why. The frozen moment described by Mrs. Bantry, Marina's look of horror as Heather prattled on, remained a pivotal clue, a glimpse into a truth that had sparked murder. Miss Marple's morning had been spent in quiet reflection, her thoughts circling the motives of those at Gossington Hall. Jason Rudd's fierce loyalty, Ella Zielinski's cold efficiency, and Margot Bentz's enigmatic watchfulness each suggested a stake in Marina's world, a reason to silence Heather if her chatter threatened, to unravel a carefully guarded secret, the hospital in Leeds, the adoption, the whispered phone calls to America. These were threads in a tapestry, and Miss Marple sensed that the frozen moment held the key to their pattern. The arrival of Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her face flushed from the walk and her eyes alight with fresh gossip, broke Miss Marple's reverie. "Jane, I've been to the hall again," she announced, shedding her straw hat and sinking into a chair. "You won't believe what I've pieced together. It's about that look on Marina's face, the one I told you about, like she'd seen a ghost. I've been thinking it over, and I'm certain it happened just as Heather was talking about that wartime show. I saw it clear as day, and I'm not the only one." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained placid. "Indeed. Dolly, that is most interesting. Who else noticed it, and what did they say?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice hushed with excitement. "I was chatting with Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, who was near the marquee. She didn't see Marina's face, but she heard Heather going on about meeting Marina in Leeds, how She'd queued for hours and got a handshake. Mrs. Price said Heather was loud, as usual, and Marina was nodding, but then she went still, like a statue. Mrs. Price thought it was just Marina being polite, but now she wonders if something Heather said upset her. And Jenny, the maid at the hall, told me Marina's been worse since the fete. Barely leaves her room. Takes pills to sleep. Doesn't that sound like guilt, Jane? Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for her knitting, though her hands remained folded. Guilt, Dolly, or fear, she murmured. The two are often entwined. Marina's reaction suggests Heather's words touched a nerve, something beyond a fan's enthusiasm. Did Mrs. Price or Jenny mention anything else? Anyone near Marina at that moment, perhaps? Mrs. Bantry frowned, her brow creasing. Jenny said Jason Rudd was right beside Marina, as always, looking like he'd pounce if anyone got too close. Ella Zielinski was off to one side, fussing with some papers, and Margot Bence was setting up her camera nearby, though Jenny swears she was watching Marina more than her lens. Oh, and the vicar was there, chatting with a few villagers, but he was too far to hear much. It's maddening, Jane. Everyone was there, but no one saw the poison. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. Maddening, yes, but revealing. A crowd is both a shield and a spotlight, Dolly. Someone used it to their advantage. Thank you for your vigilance. If you could ask Jenny about Margot's photographs, where she takes them, what she captures, it might help. Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with mischief. I'm on it, Jane. I'll be your sleuth yet. But do you think Marina did it? Or someone covering for her? Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, a gentle, knowing smile. I think, Dolly, that the frozen moment is a window, and we must look through it carefully. Marina, or someone near her, saw something in Heather's words that could not be borne. We must find out what. She paused, her gaze drifting to the garden, where a bee buzzed among the lavender. Patience, Dolly, and watchfulness. The truth is there, waiting. As Mrs. Bantry departed, promising further reports, Miss Marple resolved to visit Gossington Hall herself. Her frail health made such outings rare, but her curiosity, sharpened by the case, demanded action. With Cherry's help, she arranged for a taxi, and by mid-afternoon she was at the hall's gates, her stick tapping the gravel as she made her slow way to the entrance. The grand house, with its Georgian elegance, seemed to watch her approach, its windows glinting in the sun. Mrs. Bantry, who had stayed on to ensure Miss Marple's visit was welcome, greeted her at the door. Jane, you're a marvel. Marina's in the drawing-room, and Jason's with her. I told them you're an old friend, keen to offer condolences. They're expecting you. Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild, but her eyes alert. Thank you, Dolly. Let us see what we can learn. The drawing-room was a study in opulence, its walls adorned with gilt-framed paintings, and its furniture a blend of antique and modern. Marina Gregg reclined on a chaise longue, her pale green dress pooling around her like water. Her beauty, even in repose, was striking, though her eyes held a haunted quality, and her hands fidgeted with a silk scarf. Jason Rudd stood by the window, his lean frame taut, his dark eyes flicking to Miss Marple with polite curiosity. Ella Zielinski, seated at a desk, glanced up from her papers, her expression neutral, while Margot Bence, arranging a vase of roses, offered a fleeting smile before returning to her task. "Miss Marple," Marina said, her voice soft but warm. "How kind of you to come. This has been such a dreadful time. Poor Mrs. Badcock, I can't bear to think of it." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, though Miss Marple noted a practised grace in her gestures. "I was sorry to hear of it, Miss Gregg," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with Cherry's assistance. "St. Mary Mead is a quiet place, and such a tragedy shocks us all. I understand Mrs. Badcock was a great admirer of yours." Marina's smile faltered, her fingers tightening on the scarf. "Yes, she was very kind. She spoke of meeting me years ago during the war. It was touching to be remembered." Her voice trailed off, and she glanced at Jason, who moved closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Marina's been under a strain," Jason said, his tone firm but courteous. The fete was meant to be a fresh start, a way to connect with the village. This has hit her hard. Miss Marple's eyes, pale and piercing, studied them both. "I can imagine, Mr. Rudd. A public life must be challenging, with so many eyes upon you. Mrs. Badcock, I'm told, was quite talkative. Her stories might have stirred old memories, perhaps unexpectedly." Marina's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, a flash of something, fear, perhaps, crossing her face before she masked it with a smile. "She was enthusiastic, yes. I'm afraid I didn't listen closely. There were so many people, so much noise." She shivered, pulling the scarf closer. "I keep thinking that drink was meant for me. It's a nightmare." Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle but probing. "A nightmare indeed. Yet it was poor Mrs. Badcock who drank it. I wonder, Miss Gregg, if you noticed anything odd that day. Someone near the tray, perhaps, or watching you closely." Marina shook her head, her expression vague. "It's all a blur. I was so busy, smiling, shaking hands. Ella was handling the drinks, and Jason was nearby. Margot was taking photographs, I think. I didn't see anything strange." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Ella Zielinski, whose pen had paused over her papers. "Miss Zielinski, you were in charge of the daiquiris, I believe. It must have been a hectic task, keeping everything in order." Ella's eyes met Miss Marple's, cool and composed. "It was busy, yes. I poured the drinks and set the tray out. After that, I was dealing with guests, answering questions. I didn't see anyone tamper with anything, if that's what you mean." Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. "Of course. And you, Miss Bence, you were capturing the day, I understand. It must give you a unique perspective, seeing everyone through your lens." Margot's hands stilled on the roses, her expression guarded. "I was focused on my work, Miss Marple. The fete was crowded, and I was trying to get good shots. I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the careful responses, the subtle tensions in the room. Her eyes drifted to a photograph on the mantel, a publicity still of Marina in a wartime film, her smile radiant yet tinged with melancholy. Something about it stirred a memory, a connection she couldn't yet place. "You have a beautiful home," she said, her tone conversational. "It must be a comfort after such a tragedy." Jason's jaw tightened, though his voice remained polite. "We're trying to make it a home, Miss Marple, but this incident has made things difficult. We appreciate your concern." Miss Marple rose, leaning on her stick. "I won't keep you, Mr. Rudd, Miss Gregg. Thank you for your time. I hope the village can return to its peace soon." She paused, her eyes lingering on Marina. Memories, you know, can be both a treasure and a burden. It's wise to handle them gently. As Cherry helped her to the taxi, Miss Marple's mind was alight with impressions. Marina's fragility, Jason's protectiveness, Ella's detachment, Margot's reticence. Each was a piece in the puzzle, and the photograph on the mantel had sparked a new thread. She recalled Raymond's words about Marina's wartime films, her tours for the troops. Had Heather's story, told in that crowded marquee, echoed a moment from that time, a moment Marina could not bear to revisit? Back at the cottage, Miss Marple was greeted by Inspector Craddock, who had arrived with fresh developments. He settled into the armchair, his notebook open, his face a mix of determination and fatigue. "Miss Marple," he began, "we've made some progress, but it's a tangled mess. We've traced Margot Bentz's past, as you suggested. She was in Leeds in 1943, working as a photographer's assistant, covering events like the charity show where Heather met Marina. It's possible she crossed paths with Heather, or knew of Marina's hospital stay, but there's no record of her at St. Anselm's, and she denies any connection." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her voice thoughtful. "Possible, Inspector, is a powerful word. Miss Bentz's presence in Leeds, and now at the ambulance meetings, suggests more than coincidence. Have you asked her about the photograph she's been taking at the hall?" Craddock nodded, flipping a page. "I did, and she was cagey. Said, they're for a personal project, memories of their time here. But Jenny, the maid, told me Margot's been photographing odd places. The old stables, the attic, even the cellar. It's like she's searching for something or documenting it." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if tracing a pattern. Searching or preserving. Either way, it's significant. "And the adoption records. Any trace of the child?" Craddock sighed, his frustration evident. "We've hit a wall. Margaret Ellison, the adopted daughter, seems to have vanished after her parents' death. She was at university in London, then dropped out. No address, no job records. We're checking hostels, friends, anything. But it's slow. If she's alive, she could be the key, or a red herring." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Patience, Inspector. The frozen moment, as Mrs. Bantry calls it, is our guide." Heather's words triggered Marina's fear, and that fear drove someone to act. The child, the hospital, the photographs. These are clues to that fear. Press Miss Bentz and watch Mr. Rudd. His loyalty may blind him or bind him to Marina's secrets. Craddock rose, tucking his notebook away. "You've a knack for seeing the heart of things, Miss Marple. I'll follow up on Margot and the photographs, and keep digging for Margaret Ellison. If you hear anything—" "I shall let you know," Miss Marple said, her tone steady. "Be careful, Inspector. The frozen moment is a crack in the facade, and those who hide behind facades are dangerous when exposed." As Craddock departed, the evening light softened, casting a rosy glow over the cottage. Miss Marple remained by the window, her thoughts turning to the frozen moment. She thought of Marina Gregg, whose beauty masked a shadowed past, and of Margot Benze, whose photographs might hold more than memories. The child, the hospital, the poison. They were pieces of a mosaic, and Miss Marple knew that with time the pattern would emerge. She thought of Heather Badcock, whose life had ended in a moment of careless chatter, and of Marina Gregg, whose fear had cast a deadly shadow. The sun dipped low, bathing St. Mary Mead in twilight, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the frozen moment where the truth lay waiting to be thawed. Chapter 8. A Second Tragedy. The sultry August days in St. Mary Mead carried a restless edge, as if the village itself sensed the gathering storm of the mystery at Gossington Hall. Heather Badcock's death, now a week past, had settled into the collective consciousness like a bruise, tender and persistent. The initial shock had given way to a wary vigilance, with villagers glancing over their shoulders and lowering their voices when speaking of Marina Gregg and her entourage. At her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the open window, a light breeze stirring the curtains. Her knitting remained untouched, the pink scarf a soft heap in its basket, as her mind wove through the intricate threads of the case, the frozen moment, Marina Gregg's look of horror as Heather prattled about their wartime encounter had become Miss Marple's lodestar. Inspector Craddock's revelations about Marina's secret child, born in a Leeds hospital where Heather had worked, pointed to a motive rooted in a buried past. Yet the precision of the poisoning, with higher skin in a single daiquiri, suggested a cold, deliberate hand. And Miss Marple knew that the killer's identity lay at the intersection of opportunity and desperation. The latest clues, Margot Bentz's curious photographs and her presence in Leeds in 1943, added a new layer, hinting at a deeper connection to Marina's world. Miss Marple's morning had been spent in quiet contemplation, her thoughts circling the dynamics of Gossington Hall, Jason Rudd's protective devotion, Ella Zielinski's icy efficiency, and Margot Bentz's enigmatic reserve, each suggested a stake in Marina's carefully curated life. The photograph on the mantel, glimpsed during her visit to the hall, had stirred a vague memory, perhaps of Marina's wartime films or a related scandal. Miss Marple resolved to pursue this thread, but her musings were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Cherry Baker entered, her face pale and her usual cheer subdued. "Miss Marple, it's awful!" she exclaimed, sinking into a chair. "There's been another death at Gossington Hall. Ella Zielinski, the secretary. They found her this morning, poisoned, just like Heather." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her voice remained calm. "Poisoned, you say? Tell me everything, Cherry, from the beginning." Cherry took a deep breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "I was at the post office when Mrs. Price came in, near tears. She'd heard it from Jenny, the maid at the hall. Ella was in her office, working late last night. This morning Jenny went to bring her tea and found her slumped over the desk, dead. Dr. Haydock was called, and he said it was cyanide. Smelled it at once, like almonds. The police are there now, and the village is in a panic. 2 poisonings in a week, Miss Marple. What's happening?" Miss Marple leaned back, her mind racing. Cyanide, unlike hyoscine, was swift and unmistakable, a bold choice that suggested either panic or audacity. Was there anything unusual about the scene, Cherry? A cup, a glass, anything that might hold the poison? Cherry nodded, her eyes wide. Mrs. Price said Jenny mentioned a teacup on the desk, half drunk, with a bitter smell. The police took it away, but they think that's how the cyanide was given. Ella was alone, or so Jenny thought. No one heard anything last night. But Miss Marple, why Ella? She was so proper, always in control. Who'd want her dead? Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for her knitting, though her hands remained folded. Control, Cherry, can mask many things, Knowledge, ambition, even fear. Ella may have known something or suspected it about Heather's death. Tell me, was there anything else? Any talk of what Ella was doing before she died? Cherry frowned, thinking. Jenny told Mrs. Price that Ella had been edgy lately, more than usual. She was sorting through old letters, burning some in the grate, and she'd had a row with Margot Bentz yesterday afternoon. Jenny didn't hear much, but Ella was sharp, telling Margot to keep to her place. And Jason Rudd was, in a state, pacing the hall, muttering about protecting Marina. It's all so strange, Miss Marple. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. A second poisoning shifted the landscape of the case, suggesting either a pattern or a desperate attempt to cover tracks. Ella's argument with Margot, her destruction of letters, and Jason's agitation were new pieces in the puzzle, each pointing to a household under strain. "You've done well, Cherry," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "If you hear more from Jenny about those letters or Margot's movements, let me know at once." Cherry rose, her expression a mix of worry and determination. "I will, Miss Marple. But it's frightening, isn't it? 2 women dead and no one safe." Miss Marple's eyes met Cherry's, steady and grave. "Frightening, yes, but fear sharpens the mind, Cherry. We must use it to see clearly. Now, have a cup of tea before you go. It steadies the nerves." As Cherry bustled to the kitchen, Miss Marple leaned back, her thoughts racing. Cyanide was a dramatic choice. Its almond-like odour, a signature that could not be mistaken. Unlike Heather's subtle poisoning, this was overt, almost theatrical, as if the killer wished to send a message, or silence a threat quickly. Ella, with her access to Marina's correspondence and her sharp intellect, might have pieced together a truth about Heather's death, or stumbled upon a secret that made her dangerous. The afternoon brought Inspector Craddock, his face etched, with the exhaustion of a case that had doubled in complexity. He settled into the armchair, declining tea with a weary wave, his notebook open. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice taut, "you've heard about Ella Zielinski, I presume. Cyanide in her tea, found this morning. It's a nightmare. 2 poisonings in a week, and the press are circling like vultures. I need your insight now more than ever." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained grave. "I'm sorry to hear it, Inspector. 2 deaths so close together suggest a desperate hand or a ruthless one. What have you learned about Miss Zielinski's death?" Craddock leaned forward, his voice low. Ella was in her office, a small room off the main hall, working late. Jenny found her at 8 this morning, slumped over her desk. The teacup had traces of cyanide, confirmed by Dr. Haydock and the lab in Much Benham. The tea was brewed in the kitchen, but the pot was clean, no poison there. Someone added the cyanide to her cup, likely between 10 last night, when Jenny saw her alive, and midnight, when the household retired. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry. Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked softly. "And who was in the house last night, Inspector? Who had access to Miss Zielinski's office?" Craddock flipped a page in his notebook. The usual lot. Marina, Jason, Margot, the cook and a maid, plus a driver who lives in the lodge. Marina was in her room, taking sedatives according to Jason. He was in the library, working on scripts until 11. Margot was in her darkroom, developing photos, and claims she went to bed around 10:30. The cook and maid were in their quarters, and the driver was at the lodge. No one admits to seeing Ella after 10, and no one heard anything unusual. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A quiet house, yet a deadly one. Cyanide is swift, Inspector, but it requires preparation. Was there anything on Miss Zielinski's desk? Papers, letters, anything that might suggest why she was targeted? Craddock nodded, his pen moving swiftly. That's the odd part. Her desk was tidy, but there was a burnt scrap in the grate, like she'd been destroying papers. And we found a note, tucked under her blotter, in her handwriting. Ask Margot. Add about the hospital. It's cryptic, but it points to Margot Bentz, and maybe that leads connection we've been chasing. I've questioned Margot, and she's shaken. Says she has no idea what Ella meant. Insists she never worked at St. Anselm's. Say, Marple's eyes narrowed, her voice thoughtful. A note and a burning of papers. Miss Zielinski was tidying up, Inspector, or covering something. That note suggests she suspected Margot, or knew something about her past. Have you searched her room, or her photographs? Craddock sighed, his frustration evident. We're going through her room now, but it's slow. Hundreds of photos, negatives, notes. Margot's been cooperative, but she's guarded, like she's weighing every word. I'm having her Leeds days checked again, to see if she crossed paths with Heather or Marina beyond the charity show. But Miss Marple, why Ella? Was she a threat or just in the wrong place? Miss Marple leaned back, her needles pausing. Miss Zielinski, Inspector, was a woman of order, and order brings clarity. She may have seen a pattern, perhaps in Heather's death, or in Marina's past, that made her dangerous. That note about Margot suggests she was probing, and probers are rarely welcome. Consider who benefits from her silence. Marina, perhaps, if Ella knew her secret. Mr. Rudd if he feared Ella's knowledge, or Margot if Ella was close to exposing her. Craddock jotted furiously, his expression a mix of skepticism and intrigue. You're thinking it's all tied to the child, aren't you? Marina's daughter, and whatever Heather knew about her. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, a gentle, knowing smile. I think, Inspector, that secrets are like cracks in a mirror. Once they appear, they spread. Heather's death was the first crack, Ella's the second. The child, the hospital, the photographs, these are the lines we must follow. Have you made progress on tracing Margaret Ellison? Craddock shook his head, his voice tight. Not much. We've found a possible lead. A Margaret Ellison who worked as a typist in London 2 years ago, but she's since moved, no forwarding address. We're checking hostels, relatives, anything. If she's Marina's daughter, and alive, she could be the key, or a target. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. A target, yes. A poisoner who strikes twice may strike again. Inspector, watch the household closely and press Miss Bentz about that note. Her photographs, too. They may hold more than memories. Craddock rose, tucking his notebook away. You've a way of cutting through the fog, Miss Marple. I'll dig into Margot's photos and the note and keep you posted. If you hear anything, I shall let you know, Miss Marple said, her tone steady. Be careful, Inspector. A second tragedy is a warning, and warnings are not given lightly. As Craddock departed, the afternoon light softened, casting a warm glow over the cottage. Miss Marple remained by the window, her thoughts turning to the second tragedy. Cyanide was a bold choice, its swiftness a contrast to the subtle hyoscine that had killed Heather. Ella's death suggested a killer who was either cornered or confident, and the note about Margot pointed to a connection that could not be ignored. The arrival of Mrs. Bantry, her face alight with fresh gossip, broke Miss Marple's reverie. "Jane, it's simply dreadful," she exclaimed, shedding her coat and settling into a chair. "Ella Zielinski, poisoned. I was at the vicarage when Mrs. Price told me. She heard it from Jenny, who's beside herself. Jenny said Ella was burning papers all yesterday, and she'd been asking odd questions about Margot, where she went, what she photographed. Doesn't that make your skin crawl?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained placid. "It does, Dolly. It suggests Miss Zielinski was on a trail, and that trail led to Miss Bent's. Did Jenny mention anything else? About Mr. Rudd, perhaps, or Marina?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, her eyes wide. "She said Jason's been like a ghost, hardly speaking, always watching Marina. And Marina's taken to her bed, refusing visitors, even the doctor. Jenny overheard Jason on the phone again, talking about keeping it quiet. She couldn't make out more, but it sounded urgent. Oh, and Margot's been in her darkroom non-stop, developing photos. Jenny thinks she's hiding something." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if tracing a pattern. "Hiding or preserving? Miss Bentz's photographs may be a record, Dolly, or a map. Keep listening, and if Jenny mentions those phone calls again, try to catch the time or the number. It could be vital." Mrs. Bantry grinned, relishing her role. "I'm your spy, Jane, but do you think Margot's the killer? Or is it Jason protecting Marina?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "I think, Dolly, that a second tragedy is a mirror, reflecting the first. Ella's death tells us the killer is afraid, and fear makes people reckless. We must watch the reflections, Margot's photos, Jason's calls, Marina's silence." She paused, her gaze drifting to the garden, where the roses glowed in the fading light. "Patience, Dolly, and care. The truth is close, but it is sharp." As Mrs. Bantry departed, promising further reports, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind weaving the threads of the case. The child, the hospital, the poisons, the note, they were pieces of a mosaic, and Miss Marple knew that with time the pattern would emerge. She thought of Heather Badcock, whose chatter had sparked a murder, and of Ella Zielinski, whose curiosity had made her a target. The second tragedy, like the first, was a crack in the facade, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the shadows, behind it, where the truth lay waiting to be exposed. The sun dipped low, bathing St. Mary Mead in twilight, and Miss Marple's mind lingered on the second tragedy, a warning that the killer's hand was not yet still. Chapter 9. The Past Resurfaces. The August heat in St. Mary Mead had softened into a gentle warmth. The village's lanes and gardens bathed in a golden light that belied the darkness of recent events. The deaths of Heather Badcock and Ella Zielinski, both poisoned within the gilded walls of Gossington Hall, had woven a thread of fear through the community. The Blue Boar's patrons spoke in hushed tones, and mothers kept their children closer, as if the shadow of murder might strike again. At her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the open window, a light breeze stirring the lace curtains. Her knitting lay untouched, the pink scarf a soft heap in its basket, as her mind sifted through the intricate layers of the case. The second tragedy, Ella Zielinski's death by cyanide had sharpened Miss Marple's focus, revealing a killer who was both ruthless and desperate. The cryptic note found on Ella's desk, "Ask Margot about the hospital," pointed to Margot Bent's and the Leeds Hospital where Marina Gregg's secret child was born. Heather's wartime reminiscences, which had triggered Marina's frozen horror at the fete, suggested a connection to that buried past, one that Ella might have uncovered. Miss Marple knew that the truth lay in the interplay of motives and opportunities, and the resurfacing of Marina's history was the key to unlocking both. Miss Marple's morning had been spent in quiet reflection, her thoughts circling the dynamics of Gossington Hall. Jason Rudd's whispered phone calls, Margot's enigmatic photographs, and Marina's increasing withdrawal painted a picture of a household teetering on the edge of revelation. The photograph, on the mantel, glimpsed during her visit, had stirred a memory of Marina's wartime persona, perhaps tied to a film or a scandal that Heather's chatter had unwittingly evoked. Miss Marple resolved to pursue this thread, but her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Dermot Craddock, his face etched with the strain of a case that refused to yield. Craddock settled into the armchair, his notebook open, his expression a mix of determination and fatigue. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice low, "this case is like chasing shadows. Ella Zielinski's death has turned everything upside down, and the press are hounding us for answers. I've got new information, but it's raising more questions. I'd value your thoughts." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained grave. "I'm only an old woman, Inspector, but I'm happy to listen. What have you discovered?" Craddock leaned forward, his pen poised. "We've been digging deeper into the Leeds connection, as you suggested. St. Anselm's Hospital records are spotty, but we've confirmed Marina gave birth there in October 1943, under the alias Mary Crane. Heather Badcock was a volunteer aide at the time, running errands, fetching tea, and chatting with the nurses. There's no direct evidence she knew about Marina's child, but she was in the maternity ward often, and nurses' logs mention her curiosity. She asked questions about patients, including Miss Crane, though there's no record of her seeing the baby." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for her knitting, though her hands remained folded. "Curiosity, Inspector, can be a dangerous trait. Heather was young, impressionable, and talkative. If she overheard a name or saw a face, she might have remembered it years later when she met Marina at the charity show. At the fete, her reminiscences could have sparked a recognition in Marina, or a fear that Heather knew more than she. Let on." Craddock nodded, flipping a page in his notebook. "That's what I'm thinking. Heather's story at the fete was loud, public, about queuing to meet Marina, shaking her hand, the thrill of it all. If she mentioned the hospital, even in passing, it could have sounded like a threat to Marina, especially if she's guarded that secret for years. But here's the rub. Why kill Ella? That note, "Ask Margot about the hospital," suggests Ella was digging and someone wanted her stopped. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her voice thoughtful. "Miss Zielinski was a woman of precision, Inspector. She sorted Marina's life, letters, schedules, secrets. If she suspected a link between Heather's death and the hospital, or if she knew Margot's role in that past, she became a liability. Cyanide is swift, almost theatrical, a sign of panic, or a need to silence quickly. Have you learned more about Miss Bence's time in Leeds?" Craddock sighed, his frustration evident. "We've confirmed Margot was there in 1943, working as a photographer's assistant, covering events like the charity show. She was young, barely 20, and moved in circles that overlapped with marinas, film people, charity organisers. But there's no record of her at St Anselm's, and she insists she never met Heather or knew about Marina's child. Her photographs from that time are gone, she says, lost in a studio fire years ago. I'm having her story checked, but it's like grasping at smoke." Miss Marple leaned back, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "Smoke, Inspector, can hide fire. Miss Spence's presence in Leeds and her note on Ella's desk are too pointed to be coincidence. Her photographs at the hall, those odd corners, the stables, the attic, may be a search or a cover. Have you searched her darkroom? Or asked Mr. Rudd about his phone calls to America?" Craddock's pen moved swiftly, jotting notes. "We've gone through her darkroom. Hundreds of negatives, mostly landscapes, portraits of Marina, nothing obviously incriminating. But there's a locked box we're getting a warrant for. Could be something there. As for Rudd, he's cagey about the calls. Says they're about film deals, nothing to do with the case. But Jenny, the maid, overheard him mention the girl, and keeping it quiet. Could be the adopted daughter, Margaret Ellison, or something else entirely." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "The girl, yes. Have you made progress tracing Miss Ellison?" Craddock shook his head, his voice tight. "We've got a lead, a Margaret Ellison, who worked as a librarian in Brighton until last year, then left suddenly. No current address, but we're checking friends, former colleagues. She'd be 22, matches the age of Marina's daughter. If she's alive and knows her origins, she could be a motive or a target. I've got men watching the hall just in case." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. "A target indeed. A killer who strikes twice is bold, Inspector, and boldness grows with success. Tell me, what of the cyanide? Its source, its availability?" Craddock flipped a page, his expression grim. "That's another headache. Cyanide's not easy to come by, but it's used in photography, developing chemicals, that sort of thing. Margot's darkroom has traces, but it's standard for her work, nothing suspicious. The hall's old stables, where she's been photographing, had rat poison stored years ago. Could have been cyanide-based, but we found none. Ella's tea was brewed in the kitchen, and the pot was clean, so the poison was added to her cup, likely in her office. Someone in the house had access, but we've no fingerprints, no witnesses." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze distant. "Access and intent. Cyanide is a statement, Inspector, unlike the subtle hyoscine that killed Heather. The killer wanted Ella dead quickly, perhaps because she was close to a truth. That note about Margot suggests Ella was probing the hospital connection, and Margot's denial may hide more than she admits. Have you confronted her with the note?" Craddock nodded, his pen poised. "I did this morning." She went pale. Said Ella must have been mistaken, that she's never been to St Anselm's. But her hands were shaking, and she kept glancing at Jason, like she was waiting for him to step in. He didn't, just watched her stone-faced. "Marina wasn't there. She's been in her room, barely speaking since Ella's death." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, a gentle, knowing smile. "Stone-faced, yes. Mr. Rudd's silence is as telling as his words, Inspector. His loyalty to Marina may blind him or bind him, to her secrets. And Marina's withdrawal, grief or guilt? We must watch them all, and the photographs. If Miss Bense is documenting something or searching, those images may hold the key. Craddock jotted furiously, his expression a mix of scepticism and intrigue. You're thinking Margot's the link, aren't you? Her past, her photos, that note, it all circles back to her. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. I think, Inspector, that the past resurfaces like a tide, and Margot Bense is caught in its pull. Heather's death was the first wave, Ella's the second. The hospital, the child, the photographs, these are the currents we must follow. Search that locked box and press Miss Bence about Leeds. May Dieu, silences like Mr. Rudd's may speak louder than her words. Craddock rose, tucking his notebook away. You've a way of making the pieces fit, Miss Marple. I'll get into that box, and I'm putting a man on Margot's movements. If you hear anything, I shall let you know, Miss Marple said, her tone steady. Be careful, Inspector. The past is a dangerous place, and those who guard it are fiercer when cornered. As Craddock departed, the afternoon light softened, casting a warm glow over the cottage. Miss Marple remained by the window, her thoughts turning to the past that had resurfaced. The hospital in Leeds, where Marina's child was born and Heather worked, was the nexus of the mystery, and Ella's note had drawn a line to Margot Bense. The cyanide, the burnt papers, the whispered phone calls, they were signs of a secret unraveling, and Miss Marple knew that the killer was growing reckless. The arrival of Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her face alight with fresh gossip, broke Miss Marple's reverie. "Jane, it's simply ghastly," she exclaimed, shedding her hat and settling into a chair. "I was at the hall this morning, and the place is like a tomb. Jenny says Marina's taken to her bed, refusing even Jason's company, and he's been snapping at everyone. But here's the bit you'll want. Jenny found a photograph in the library, tucked behind a book. It's old, from the war, showing Marina at a charity show, and there's a girl in the background who looks like Margot Bence." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained placid. "A photograph, Dolly. That is significant. Did Jenny describe it further? The setting, perhaps, or others in the image?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, her eyes wide. "She said it's a crowd scene. Marina on a stage, smiling, with soldiers and civilians clapping. The girl, Margot, Jenny thinks, is off to one side, holding a camera, looking at Marina. Jenny didn't recognize anyone else, but she said the photo was creased, like it had been handled a lot. She put it back, afraid of getting caught, but she told me because she trusts me. Doesn't that send shivers down your spine, Jane?" Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if tracing a pattern. "It does, Dolly. A photograph from that time, with Margot present, ties her to Marina's past more firmly than her denials allow. It may explain Ella's note and why she became a target. Did Jenny mention anything else? About Mr. Rudd's calls or Marina's state?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice hushed. "She said Jason's been on the phone again, late at night, talking about the girl and making sure she stays away. Jenny couldn't hear the other end, but he sounded desperate. And Marina? Jenny says she overheard her crying, muttering about the child and never being free. It's like they're all haunted, Jane." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. "Haunted, yes. The past resurfaces, Dolly, and it brings its ghosts. That photograph, if it is Margot, places her in Marina's orbit at a critical time. Keep listening, and if Jenny can describe that image further, or better, retrieve it, it could be vital. Mrs. Bantry grinned, relishing her role. I'm your eyes and ears, Jane. But do you think Margot's the killer? Or is it Jason, hiding something for Marina? Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. I think, Dolly, that the past is a mirror, and its reflections are dangerous. Margot's photographs, Jason's calls, Marina's tears, they all point to a secret that Heather and Ella touched. The killer struck to keep it buried, but the past will not stay silent. She paused, her gaze drifting to the garden, where the roses glowed in the fading light. Patience, Dolly, and care. The truth is rising, and it will not be denied. As Mrs. Bantry departed, promising further reports, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind weaving the threads of the case. The child, the hospital, the poisons, the photograph. They were pieces of a mosaic, and Miss Marple knew that with time the pattern would emerge. She thought of Heather Badcock, whose chatter had sparked a murder, and of Ella Zielinski, whose curiosity had made her a victim. The past, resurfacing like a tide, had claimed 2 lives, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the shadows it cast, where the killer's hand waited to strike again. The sun dipped low, bathing St. Mary Mead, in twilight, and Miss Marple's mind lingered on the past that had resurfaced, a truth that was both fragile and deadly. Chapter 10. The Mirror's Crack. The early August twilight draped St. Mary Mead in a soft violet haze, the village's cottages and hedgerows glowing faintly as the day surrendered to night. Yet beneath this tranquil veneer, a restless tension simmered, fed by the twin tragedies at Gossington Hall. Heather Badcock's poisoning at the Fete, followed by Ella Zielinski's death by cyanide, had woven a web of fear and suspicion that no amount of summer warmth could dispel. At her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the open window, the scent of jasmine drifting in from the garden. Her knitting lay untouched, the pink scarf a soft heap in its basket, as her mind turned over the intricate puzzle of the case. The past had resurfaced, its currents pulling at the lives of those at Gossington Hall. Marina Gregg's secret child, born in a Leeds hospital where Heather Badcock had worked, was the linchpin, and Heather's wartime reminiscences at the Fete had sparked a deadly reaction. Ella's note, "Ask Margot about the hospital," had pointed to Margot Bentz, whose presence in Leeds and her cryptic photographs suggested a deeper role. Miss Marple knew that the killer's hand was guided by a desperate need to protect that secret, and the mirror of Marina's carefully crafted life was cracking under the strain. Miss Marple's morning had been spent in quiet reflection, her thoughts circling the clues that had accumulated. Jason Rudd's whispered phone calls, Margot's photographs of obscure corners, and Marina's increasing withdrawal. The wartime photograph found by Jenny, showing Margot in the background of Marina's charity show, had tightened the connection to Leeds, and Ella's probing had cost her life. Miss Marple sensed that the truth was close, but its edges were sharp, and she needed to tread carefully to avoid another tragedy. The arrival of Inspector Dermot Craddock, his face drawn with the weight of the investigation, broke her reverie. He settled into the armchair, his notebook open, his expression a blend of determination and unease. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice low. "This case is like a house of cards. One wrong move, and it collapses. We've got new leads, but they're pulling us in circles. I need your clarity now more than ever." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained grave. "I'm only an old woman, Inspector, but I'm happy to help. What have you uncovered?" Craddock leaned forward, his pen poised. "We've cracked open Margot Bentz's locked box from the darkroom. Inside were photographs, not the usual portraits or landscapes, but old ones from the war. One matches Jenny's description. Marina on a stage in Leeds, 1943, with Margot in the background holding a camera. There's another blurry of a hospital corridor, St. Anselm's, we think, based on the signage. No faces, just walls and doors, but it's dated October 1943, when Marina gave birth. Margot swears she took it for a photography project. Nothing to do with Marina, but I'm not convinced." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for her knitting, though her hands remained folded. "Photographs, Inspector, are like memories, selective and revealing. Miss Bentz's choice to keep these locked away suggests they hold meaning. The hospital image in particular is telling. If she was there, even briefly, she could have known about Marina's child, or seen Heather. Have you pressed her further?" Craddock nodded, flipping a page in his notebook. "I did, this morning. She's rattled, but sticking to her story. Says she was experimenting with light and shadow, no connection to Marina or Heather. But her eyes gave her away, Miss Marple. Shifting, like she's hiding something. I've also got a lead on Margaret Ellison, the adopted daughter. We've traced her to a boarding house in Bristol, where she stayed last month. She's using the name Maggie Ellis now, working as a shop assistant. I've sent a man to find her, but she's slippery, moves often." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her voice thoughtful. "Maggie Ellis, a shadow of her past. If she knows her origins, or if someone fears she might, she could be in danger, or a key to the motive. The photographs, the note about Margot, the hospital, they all point to that secret birth. Heather's chatter at the fete, if it hinted at the child, would have been a spark to dry tinder. And Ella, probing Margot's past, became a flame that had to be extinguished." Craddock sighed, his frustration evident. "That's what I'm grappling with. Heather's death was precise. Hyoscine in one glass, no mistakes. Ella's was messier, cyanide in her tea, like the killer was rushed. But how did they do it? The decory tray was crowded, and Marina picked the glass herself. Ella's tea was in her office, alone. It's like the killer's invisible." Miss Marple leaned back, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "Invisible, Inspector, or unnoticed. A clever person blends into the chaos of a crowd, or the quiet of a house. Let us reconstruct the fate, step by step. The tray of daiquiris was prepared by Ella, yes, and left on the table for 20 minutes. Craddock nodded, consulting his notes. "Right. Ella poured the drinks, set the tray out, then got distracted by guests. Jason was nearby, watching Marina. Margot was setting up her camera, in and out. The vicar, a few villagers, the band. They were all close, but no one saw anything odd. Marina took a glass from the tray when Heather approached, handed it over, and Heather drank it almost at once." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "And during Heather's chatter, what was happening? Mrs. Bantry described Marina's frozen look. But what of the others? Where was Mr. Rudd or Miss Bence? Craddock frowned, flipping back through his notes. Jason was at Marina's side, his hand on her arm, like he was steadying her. Margot was a few feet away, adjusting her camera, but Jenny said she was watching Marina closely. The vicar was talking to Mrs. Price, and the crowd was buzzing. Heather's voice drew attention. It was a perfect distraction, now I think of it. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her voice soft but probing. A distraction, yes. Heather's chatter was a spotlight, pulling every eye. In that moment, a quick hand could have acted, slipped hyoscine into the glass Marina held, or swapped it with another. Marina, caught in her fear, might not have noticed. But the tray itself, were the glasses identical, or was there something to mark one? Craddock's pen paused, his expression thoughtful. Identical, as far as we know. The lab found no smudges, no marks, but they were rushed. I'll have them check again. Look for anything subtle. A scratch, a tilt. You're thinking the killer guided Marina's choice, aren't you? Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, a gentle, knowing smile. I'm thinking, Inspector, that a mirror reflects what we choose to see. The killer used the chaos of the fete and Marina's distraction to ensure Heather drank the poison. But Ella's death, cyanide in her tea, in a locked office, suggests a different hand, or a different fear. The note about Margot points to her, but we must consider others. Mr. Rudd, with his phone calls, or Marina herself, guarding her past. Craddock jotted furiously, his expression a mix of skepticism and intrigue. You're building a case against Marina, aren't you? Her reaction, the secret child, the opportunity, it all fits. But she's so fragile, Miss Marple. Could she plan 2 murders? Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but firm. Fragility, Inspector, can be a mask. Marina has lived her life on a stage, playing roles. A secret like her, child if threatened, could drive her to desperate acts, or inspire loyalty in others. Mr. Rudd's devotion, Margot's silence, they may be her shield or her weapon. Have you searched Ella's office further? Her burnt papers, perhaps, or her correspondence? Craddock nodded, flipping a page. We've gone through it all. The burnt papers were too charred to read, but we found a letter in her desk, half-written, addressed to Marina. It's vague, says she's concerned about recent events and wants to discuss a matter privately. Could be about Heather, or Margot, or something else. We're analysing it for prints, but it's a long shot. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind cataloguing the detail. A letter, unfinished. Miss Zielinski was cautious, Inspector, and her caution cost her life. That note about Margot, and now this letter, suggest she was closing in on the truth. We must find what she knew, and why it was worth killing for. Craddock rose, tucking his notebook away. You've given me plenty to work with, Miss Marple. I'll recheck the tray, dig into that letter, and track down Maggie Ellis. If Margot's hiding something, I'll shake it out of her. If you hear anything, I shall let you know, Miss Marple said, her tone steady. Be careful, Inspector. The mirror's crack is widening, and those who see their reflection may strike again. As Craddock departed, the twilight deepened, casting long shadows across the cottage. Miss Marple remained by the window, her thoughts turning to the mirror's crack. The hospital, the child, the photographs, the poisons. They were pieces of a mosaic, and the frozen moment at the fete was its centre. She recalled Marina's look of horror, described by Mrs. Bantry, and a new thought struck her. What if Marina's fear was not just of exposure, but of recognition? Heather's story, with its wartime details, might have painted a picture that Marina could not ignore, a picture of a past she thought buried. The arrival of Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her face alight with fresh gossip, broke Miss Marple's reverie. "Jane, you'll want to hear this," she exclaimed, shedding her shawl and settling into a chair. "I was at the hall this afternoon, and Jenny's in a state. She found another photograph, not the wartime one, but a recent one, slipped under Marina's door. It's of the old stables, where Margot's been poking about, and there's a note on the back, 'You can't hide forever.' Jenny didn't dare keep it, but she showed me before putting it back. Doesn't that make your blood run cold?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained placid. "It does, Dolly. A photograph and a note delivered to Marina. It suggests someone is pressing her or warning her. Did Jenny describe the stables? Anything unusual?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, her eyes wide. "She said they're run down, used for storage. Old trunks, gardening tools, that sort of thing. Margot's been photographing the beams, the walls, like she's looking for something hidden. Jenny thinks it's odd, but she's too scared to ask. And Jason, Jenny says he's been out there too, late at night, checking the locks. Oh, and Marina's worse, Jane. Won't leave her room. Keeps muttering about the truth coming out." Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if tracing a pattern. "The stables, the photograph, the note, they are pieces of the crack, Dolly. Margot's search, Jason's vigilance, Marina's fear. They all point to a secret that Heather and Ella touched. Keep listening, and if Jenny can get that photograph, or describe the note's handwriting, it could be vital." Mrs. Bantry grinned, relishing her role. "I'm your spy, Jane. But do you think it's Marina? Or Margot playing some game?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "I think, Dolly, that the mirror's crack is a wound, and it bleeds in those who guard it. Heather's death was the first cut, Ella's the second. The past, Marina's child, the hospital, the photographs, is the blade. We must find its edge before it cuts again." She paused, her gaze drifting to the garden, where the jasmine glowed in the fading light. "Patience, Dolly, and care. The truth is near, and it is sharp." As Mrs. Bantry departed, promising further reports, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind weaving the threads of the case. The child, the hospital, the poisons, the photographs. They were pieces of a puzzle, and the mirror's crack was its heart. She thought of Heather Badcock, whose chatter had sparked a murder, and of Ella Zielinski, whose curiosity had made her a victim. The stables, with their secrets, loomed in her mind, and a sudden clarity struck her. The daiquiri, handed by Marina, might not have been poisoned on the tray, but in the moment of exchange, when all eyes were on Heather. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, a steady rhythm as she reconstructed the fate. Marina, holding her own glass, had set it down. As Heather approached, her attention caught by the flood of reminiscences. In that instant, with Jason at her side and Margot nearby, a swap could have been made. A poisoned glass slipped into Marina's hand, or her own tainted as she reached for another. Marina, distracted by fear, would not have noticed, and Heather, eager and oblivious, drank the fatal dose. It was a bold move, but possible, and it shifted the focus from the tray to the moment of delivery. She thought of Marina Gregg, whose beauty masked a shadowed past, and of Jason Rudd, whose loyalty might have driven him to act. Margot Bence, with her photographs and her silences, was a wild card. Her role in Leeds, a question that demanded an answer. The mirror's crack, Miss Marple knew, was the secret of the child, and its reflection held the killer's face. The twilight deepened, bathing St. Mary Mead in a velvet hush, and Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the mirror's crack, where the truth lay waiting to be revealed. Chapter 11. Confronting the Star. The twilight of early August had settled over St. Mary Mead, casting a gentle glow across the village's thatched roofs and winding lanes. Yet beneath this serene facade, a palpable tension pulsed, fueled by the grim events at Gossington Hall. The poisonings of Heather Badcock and Ella Zielinski had left the community on edge, their whispers of fear mingling with the evening breeze. At her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the open window, the scent of late-blooming roses drifting in. Her knitting lay untouched, the pink scarf a soft heap in its basket, as her mind wove through the intricate threads of the case, now nearing its climax. The mirror's crack, Marina Gregg's secret child, born in a Leeds hospital where Heather Badcock had worked, had revealed a motive rooted in a desperate need to protect a buried past. Heather's wartime reminiscences at the fete had sparked Marina's frozen horror, a moment that Miss Marple believed had triggered the first murder. Ella's probing, marked by her cryptic note about Margot Bence and the hospital, had led to her own death, a second strike to silence a growing threat. The wartime photograph, Margot's locked box, and Jason Rudd's furtive phone calls had tightened the web, pointing to a killer within Marina's inner circle. Miss Marple's epiphany about the daiquiri swap, that the poison was slipped into Heather's glass, not on the tray, but in the moment of exchange, had crystallized her suspicions, and she knew the time had come to confront the truth. Miss Marple's morning had been spent in quiet preparation, her thoughts honed by the clues that had accumulated. The photograph of Marina's charity show, with Margot in the background, placed her in Leeds at a critical time, and the hospital image in her locked box suggested a deeper connection. Jason's whispered calls about the girl, and Marina's muttered fears of the truth coming out, painted a household under siege, its secrets fraying at the edges. Miss Marple had shared her theory of the glass swap with Inspector Craddock, urging him to re-examine the fate's chaos. And now she awaited his return, hoping for confirmation that would bring the case to a head. The arrival of Craddock, his face a mask of grim resolve, broke her reverie. He settled into the armchair, his notebook open, his eyes reflecting the weight of a case that had tested his limits. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice low, "your idea about the daiquiri swap was a stroke of genius. We've gone back to the fete, interviewed everyone who was near the marquee, and it's starting to come together. I need your help to make sense of it before we move on, Marina Gregg." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained grave. "I'm glad to hear it, Inspector. Tell me, what have you found?" Craddock leaned forward, his pen poised. "We spoke to Mrs. Price again, who was standing just behind Heather." She remembered Marina holding a glass, her own decory, before Heather approached. When Heather started talking, Marina set her glass on the table, distracted by the flood of chatter. Mrs. Price saw Marina pick up another glass from the tray to hand to Heather, but she couldn't swear it was the same one she'd been holding. The crowd was pressing in, and Jason Rudd was at Marina's side, his hand brushing the table as he steadied her. Margot Bence was nearby, adjusting her camera, her eyes on the scene. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for her, knitting, though her hands remained folded. A brush of the hand, Inspector, can be more than it seems. In that moment of distraction, with Heather's voice drawing every eye, a swap could have been made. Marina's glass, already poisoned, given to Heather while Marina took a clean one, or the poison was slipped into the glass Marina chose as she reached for it. Who was closest to the table? Craddock flipped a page in his notebook. Jason was right there, his hand on Marina's arm, his body shielding her from the crowd. Margot was a step away, her camera bag on the table close to the tray. Ella was further back, dealing with a guest, but she'd been near the tray earlier. The vicar and a few villagers were in the marquee, but too far to touch the glasses. It narrows to Jason or Margot, unless Marina herself did it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her voice thoughtful. Marina, caught in her fear, might not have noticed a subtle move by another. But her own hand, Inspector, could have acted with purpose. Her frozen look, as Mrs. Bantry described, was not just fear. It was recognition, a realization that Heather's story threatened her secret. "Have you learned more about the child, Maggie Ellis?" Craddock nodded, his expression grim. "We've found her, Miss Marple. Maggie Ellis, 22, working in a Bristol bookshop. She was adopted by the Ellisons, and there's a sealed record linking her to St. Anselm's, 1943. She doesn't know her origins. Her adoptive parents never told her, and she's had no contact with Marina. But if Heather's chatter hinted at the adoption, it could have sounded like a threat to Marina, especially if Maggie's existence were to come out now, with her comeback in full swing." Miss Marple leaned back, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. A threat indeed. Marina's life is built on her image, and a grown daughter, unknown and unacknowledged, could shatter it. Heather, with her innocent prattle, might have seemed a herald of that ruin. And Ella, with her note about Margot, was circling the same truth. Have you searched Margot's photographs further, or pressed Mr. Rudd about his calls? Craddock's pen moved swiftly, jotting notes. We've gone through more of Margot's negatives. Most are innocuous, but there's one, a close-up of a hospital record, dated 1943, with Mary Crane listed. It's grainy, taken in secret, but it proves Margot was at St. Anselm's despite her denials. I confronted her, and she broke down, admitted she was there, photographing for a local paper, but swore she never connected it to Marina until years later, when she joined her staff. She claims Ella's note was a misunderstanding, that she never spoke to her about the hospital. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A misunderstanding or a lie? Margot's photograph of that record is no accident, Inspector. She knew or suspected Marina's secret, and her silence may have been loyalty or leverage. And Mr. Rudd's calls? Mrs. Bantry mentioned the girl and keeping it quiet. Craddock sighed, his frustration evident. Jason's clammed up about the calls, says they're private about film deals. But we traced one number to a lawyer in Los Angeles, known for handling adoptions and discreet settlements. Jenny overheard him say the girl mustn't know, which could mean Maggie or someone else. He's protecting Marina, that's clear, but I can't tell if it's love or guilt. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her voice soft but probing. Love and guilt, Inspector, are often entwined. Mr. Rudd's devotion may have driven him to act or to cover for another. But Marina, her reaction at the fate, her withdrawal since Ella's death, points to a woman haunted by her own hand. Let us consider the daiquiri again. Marina held a glass, set it down, and took another for Heather. If the poison was in her own glass, and she swapped it deliberately, it explains the precision. Heather drank, and Marina was safe. Craddock's pen paused, his expression a mix of scepticism and intrigue. You're saying Marina poisoned her own drink, then gave it to Heather? It's bold, Miss Marple, but it fits. She'd have to be quick and cold as ice to pull it off in that crowd. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. Cold, yes, but driven by fear. Marina's life is a performance, Inspector, and performers know how to seize a moment. Heather's story, with its wartime echoes, was a spotlight on her secret. In that instant, with Jason and Margot nearby, she could have acted, swapped the glass, or slipped the poison as she handed it over. Ella, later, became a threat when she began asking about Margot and the hospital. The cyanide, swift and sure, silenced her. Craddock jotted furiously, his eyes narrowing. It's a theory, Miss Marple, and a strong one. I've got enough to bring Marina in for questioning, but I need to be sure. The photographs, the note, Maggie Ellis, they all point to her, but Jason and Margot are still in the frame. I'm heading to the hall now to confront her. Will you come? Your presence might unsettle her in a good way. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, a gentle, knowing smile. I think, Inspector, that I shall. The truth is like a mirror's crack. It spreads until it shatters. Let us see what Marina's reflection reveals. With Cherry's help, Miss Marple prepared for the journey, her frail frame steadied by her resolve. The taxi ride to Gossington Hall was brief, the grand house looming against the twilight sky, its windows aglow with a warmth that belied its secrets. Mrs. Bantry, alerted by Craddock, met them at the door, her eyes wide with anticipation. Jane, you're here. It's like a play, isn't it? Marina's in the drawing room with Jason and Margot. They're all on edge. Miss Marple nodded, her stick tapping the floor as she entered. A play, Dolly, with its final act approaching. Stay close and listen. The drawing room was as opulent as before, its gilt-framed paintings and velvet drapes a backdrop to the drama unfolding within. Marina Gregg sat on the chaise longue, her pale blue dress accentuating her ethereal beauty, though her eyes were shadowed, her hands clutching a handkerchief. Jason Rudd stood by her side, his lean frame taut, his dark eyes flicking between Craddock and Miss Marple. Margot Bence, arranging a tray of tea, paused as they entered, her expression guarded but alert. Miss Gregg, Mr. Rudd, Miss Bence, Craddock began, his voice firm. We need to talk about Heather Badcock and Ella Zielinski. New evidence has come to light, and I believe the answers lie here, in this room. Marina's eyes widened, her voice trembling. More questions? Inspector, I've told you everything. That drink, it was meant for me, I'm sure of it. I can't bear this suspicion. She turned to Jason, who squeezed her shoulder, his jaw tight. Craddock's gaze was steady. Miss Gregg, we know about your daughter, born in Leeds, 1943, under the alias Mary Crane. Heather Badcock worked at St. Anselm's Hospital then, and her story at the fete, about meeting you, the charity show, struck a nerve. You froze, Miss Gregg, as if she'd uncovered a secret. Did she know about your child? Marina's face paled, her handkerchief twisting in her hands. My child? It's private, Inspector. Yes, I had a daughter, given up long ago. It was painful, but over. Heather, she was just a fan, talking nonsense. I didn't know her. Miss Marple, seated quietly, spoke, her voice gentle but piercing. But you did know her, Miss Gregg, or her words. Mrs. Badcock's story wasn't nonsense. It was a memory, one that echoed your time in Leeds, the hospital, the child you hid. You were afraid, weren't you, that she'd tell others, that your secret would unravel your new life? Marina's eyes darted to Miss Marple, a flash of panic crossing her face. Afraid? Yes, I was startled. She went on so, about that show, the war. It brought back things I'd rather forget. But I didn't hurt her. I gave her a drink, that's all. Craddock stepped closer, his voice calm but relentless. A drink with hyoscine, Miss Gregg. We believe you swapped your glass, already poisoned, with the one you gave Heather. You set your own down, distracted by her chatter, and took another from the tray. But the poison was in your glass, wasn't it? You handed it to her, knowing what it held. Marina's breath caught, her hands trembling. No, that's monstrous. I'd never. Jason, tell them. She turned to her husband, who stared at her, his face a mask of anguish. Jason's voice was low, strained. Inspector, Marina's innocent. She's been through too much to do something so vile. The poison was meant for her. I've told you, she's had threats before. Miss Marple's eyes, pale and piercing, fixed on Marina. Threats, Mr. Rudd, or truths? Miss Zielinski knew something, didn't she? Her note about Miss Bence and the hospital. She was close to uncovering your secret. The cyanide in her tea was no accident. Someone in this house silenced her, just as they silenced Heather. Margot Bence, silent until now, spoke, her voice sharp. I had nothing to do with it, Miss Marple. Ella's note was a mistake. She thought I knew something about Leeds, but I didn't. I was just a photographer, taking pictures. I told her that. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Margot, steady and unyielding. Pictures, Miss Bence, that you kept locked away. A hospital record, a corridor at St. Anselm's. You were there, and you knew Marina's alias. Did you tell Ella, or did she find out herself? Either way, it made her dangerous. Marina's composure cracked, a sob escaping her lips. Stop it! I can't bear it. Yes, I was afraid. Heather's story, it was like a knife, cutting open the past. Thought she knew, that she'd tell everyone, ruin everything I've built. I poisoned her, God help me! I put the hyoscine in my glass, meant to drink it myself, to end it all. But when she talked, when I saw the truth in her eyes, I gave it to her instead. I didn't think, I just acted. Jason's face crumpled, his voice breaking. "Marina, no! Why didn't you tell me?" He sank beside her, his hands gripping hers as if to anchor her to reality. Craddock's voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed his shock. "And Ella Zielinski, Miss Gregg? Did she suspect you?" Marina's tears flowed freely, her voice a whisper. "Ella was too clever. She saw me flinch at the fate, started asking about Margot, the hospital. I heard her talking to Jason, saying, 'She'd write to you, Inspector. I couldn't let her. She'd ruin me, ruin Maggie, my daughter, who doesn't even know me.' I put cyanide in her tea, in her office. It was quick, merciful. I didn't want to, but I had to protect my life." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost sorrowful. "Protect, Miss Gregg, or destroy. Your secret was a mirror, and its cracks spread to those who saw it. Heather, Ella, they paid for your fear. And Maggie Ellis, your daughter, she lives, unaware, but safe now." Marina sobbed, her glamour fading like a broken spell. Jason held her, his face etched with devastation, while Margot stood frozen, her eyes wide with horror. Craddock signalled to a constable, who had entered quietly, and Marina was led away, her steps faltering, her confession echoing in the silent room. As Miss Marple and Craddock left the hall, the night air was cool, the stars sharp above. Craddock's voice was heavy. "You were right, Miss Marple. The swap, the fear, it all pointed to Marina, but I never thought she'd confess so fully." Miss Marple's eyes were distant, her voice soft. "Fear, Inspector, is a powerful force. It cracks the mirror of the soul, and Marina's was shattered long ago. She acted to save herself, but lost everything. The truth, like a mirror, reflects all." The taxi carried them back to the village, and Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Marina Gregg, whose beauty had masked a deadly desperation, and on the mirror's crack, now fully revealed. Chapter 12. The Village Restored. The gentle warmth of mid-August bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden haze, its lanes and gardens reclaiming their tranquil charm after the tempest of tragedy at Gossington Hall. The poisonings of Heather Badcock and Ella Zielinski, followed by Marina Gregg's shattering confession, had left the village reeling, but as the days passed, a tentative peace began to settle. The Blue Boar's patrons spoke less of murder and more of harvests, and children played freely again on the green. Yet the memory of those dark events lingered, a faint echo in the village's quiet rhythms. At her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the open window, the scent of late roses drifting in. Her knitting, resumed at last, clicked softly, the pink scarf growing steadily as her mind reflected on the case that had unravelled a stars-gilded facade. Marina Gregg's arrest had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead. Her confession to the murders of Heather Badcock and Ella Zielinski, a stark revelation of fear and desperation. The secret of her child, born in a Leeds hospital and given up for adoption, had been the crack in her carefully polished mirror, and Heather's innocent chatter at the fete had threatened to shatter it. Ella's probing, marked by her note about Margot Bence, had made her a second victim, silenced by cyanide to protect Marina's fragile world. Miss Marple's insight into the daiquiri swap, Marina poisoning her own glass and passing it to Heather in a moment of panic, had guided Inspector Craddock to the truth, and Marina's collapse under questioning had laid bare the human frailty beneath her glamour. Miss Marple's days since the confrontation had been quiet, her frail health limiting her outings, but her mind remained active, sifting through the aftermath. The village, she knew, would heal, but its scars would shape its stories for years to come. She thought of Marina, now in custody, her beauty dimmed by guilt, and of Jason Rudd, whose loyalty had blinded him to her crimes. Margot Bence, with her cryptic photographs and wartime ties, had emerged as a witness rather than a culprit. Her silence a complex blend of loyalty and self-preservation. The child, Maggie Ellis, remained unaware of her origins, a life untouched by the tragedy that had claimed two others. The morning brought a visitor, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her face alight with the mix of relief and curiosity that followed a mystery's resolution. She shed her straw hat and settled into the armchair, accepting tea from Cherry with a grateful nod. "Jane, it's like waking from a bad dream," she said, her voice warm but tinged with awe. "Marina Gregg, a murderess! I still can't quite believe it, though I was there when she confessed. The village is buzzing, but it's quieter now, as if we're all catching our breath. What do you make of it all?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained grave. "I make of it, Dolly, what I always do, human nature in all its frailty. Marina was a star, but stars are only human, and humans fear loss above all else. Her secret, her child, was a weight she could not bear to have exposed. Heather's words, innocent as they were a spark, and Ella's curiosity a flame. Marina acted to quench them, but in doing so she lost herself." Mrs. Bantry sipped her tea, her eyes wide. "It's so sad, Jane. She had everything, beauty, fame, a devoted husband, and yet that one secret drove her to such horrors. I keep thinking of that moment at the fete, her frozen look. You saw it for what it was, didn't you? A glimpse of her guilt." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a soothing rhythm. "Not guilt, Dolly, not then. Fear. Fear of a past resurfacing, of a life unraveling." Heather's story, with its wartime echoes, was a mirror held up to Marina's soul, and she saw her secret reflected. The Decory swap was an act of instinct, a desperate bid to silence that reflection. Ella's death, more calculated, was the same fear, grown colder. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice hushed. "And Jason Rudd, did he know Jane? He was so protective, always at her side. I can't believe he suspected nothing." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her gaze drifting to the garden. "Mr. Rudd, I think, loved Marina too much to see clearly. His phone calls, his pacing, they were signs of a man sensing danger but refusing to name it. When Marina confessed, his anguish was real, but so was his relief. The truth, however, painful, freed him from the burden of doubt. Love, Dolly, can blind as much as it binds." Mrs. Bantry nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And Margot Bence? Jenny says she's leaving the Hall, going back to London. Those photographs of hers, the hospital, the stables, were they just art or something more?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her voice soft but probing. "Miss Bence is a woman of shadows, Dolly. Her photographs were a record, perhaps of loyalty, perhaps of curiosity. She was in Leeds, at the hospital, and knew more than she admitted. Ella's note marked her as a threat, but not the killer. Margot's silence protected Marina, but it also protected herself. She will carry her own secrets, I suspect, wherever she goes. Mrs. Bantry sighed, setting her cup down. It's all so tangled, Jane. But you untangled it, as you always do. The village owes you a debt, though they'll never know it. What about the girl, Maggie Ellis? Will she ever learn the truth? Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression softening. Maggie Ellis lives her own life, unaware of the storm her birth caused. I hope, for her sake, she remains so. Some truths are better left sleeping, Dolly, though they shape us all the same. Marina's confession has closed that chapter, and Maggie is safe from its shadow. Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with mischief, though her tone was earnest. You're a marvel, Jane. I'd have been lost without your nudging me to listen, to watch. Jenny's still talking, you know, says, the hall's like a ghost house now, with Marina gone and Jason packing up. The servants are whispering about moving on, and Gossington's up for sale again. It's the end of an era. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze distant. Eras end, Dolly, and new ones begin. Gossington Hall will find new voices, new stories. Saint, Mary Mead endures, as it always has, its peace fragile but resilient. We mend what is broken, and we go on. Mrs. Bantry rose, her smile warm. You're right, Jane, and I'll keep my ears open, just in case another mystery stirs. Tea tomorrow, at the vicarage? Mrs. Price is keen to hear your thoughts, though she'll never guess how much you know. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, a gentle, knowing smile. Tomorrow, Dolly, would be lovely, and if Mrs. Price asks, I shall be just an old woman, with a fondness for gossip. The truth, you know, is best served quietly. As Mrs. Bantry departed, promising to call for her, Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. She thought of the village, its surface restored, but its depths forever marked by the events at Gossington Hall. She thought, too, of Marina Gregg, whose beauty had masked a fatal flaw, and of Heather Badcock, whose enthusiasm had been her undoing. Ella Zielinski, with her sharp mind, had seen too much, and Jason Rudd, with his blind devotion, had seen too little. Margot Bency, a silent observer, had walked the edge of the mystery. Her photographs a testament to a past that refused to stay buried. The afternoon brought a second visitor. Inspector Dermot Craddock, his face less strained now, though his eyes held a lingering shadow. He settled into the armchair, accepting tea with a grateful nod, his notebook tucked away. Miss Marple, he began, his voice warm, I owe you more than I can say. Marina's confession tied up the case, and your insight about the Daiquiri swap was the key. I've just come from the station. She's been formally charged, and Jason's arranging her defence. It's a sad end, but a just one. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained grave. Justice, Inspector, is a cold comfort, but a necessary one. Marina's fear drove her to terrible acts, and her confession, though painful, was her final performance. What of Mr. Rudd and Miss Bence? Craddock leaned back, his voice thoughtful. Jason's broken, but holding on. He's selling the Hall, heading back to America. Says he'll stand by Marina, whatever comes. Margot's leaving too, got a job with a London studio. I pressed her about the hospital photo, and she admitted she suspected Marina's secret, but never told Ella. Her silence was loyalty, not malice. She's a strange one, Miss Marple, but not a killer. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. Loyalty, Inspector, is a powerful force, for good or ill. Miss Bentis saw much and said little. Her photographs were her voice, and they spoke when she could not. And Maggie Ellis? Will her life remain untouched? Craddock's expression softened. We've decided not to contact her. There's no need. She's happy, unaware, and Marina's confession closes the case. The adoption records will stay sealed unless Maggie seeks them herself one day. It's the kindest course. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, a gentle smile. Kindness, Inspector, is a rare gift in such matters. Maggie's peace is a small victory amidst the loss. You've done well, and St. Mary Mead will sleep easier for it. Craddock rose, his smile wry. I couldn't have done it without you, Miss Marple. You see things, patterns, motives, that I miss. If another case comes up, I'll be knocking at your door. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her voice mild but firm. I hope, Inspector, that St. Mary Mead will have no more need of such visits. But if it does, I shall be here, with my knitting and my gossip. Safe travels, and take care. As Craddock departed, the evening light softened, casting a rosy glow over the cottage. Miss Marple remained by the window, her thoughts turning to the village restored. She thought of the fate, its laughter turned to horror, and of Marina's confession, a catharsis that had cleansed the air. The mirror's crack, she mused, had been Marina's secret, its shards cutting those who touched it. Heather, Ella, even Marina herself, they were victims of a past that refused to stay silent. Cherry, clearing the tea things, glanced at her employer. You look pleased, Miss Marple, she said, her tone teasing. Solved another one, didn't you? Miss Marple's lips curved, a gentle, enigmatic smile. Solved, Cherry, or simply seen. The village tells its own stories, and I only listen. Now, shall we have supper? Something simple, I think, to mark a quiet evening. Cherry grinned, bustling to the kitchen, and Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting a steady rhythm in her hands. She thought of St. Mary Mead, its peace fragile but enduring, and of the human heart, with its secrets and its sorrows. The village was restored, but its quiet held a warning, a whisper of the shadows that could return. The twilight deepened, bathing St. Mary Mead in a velvet hush, and Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the village restored, its scars a testament to truths uncovered and a peace hard won.